From my observation during 5 years at a boarding school, it seems that 8 out of 10 boys were more or less addicted to the practice, but I would not state positively that such was the proportion of masturbators among an average of 30 pupils. Though the habit was very common, I know that in one bedroom sleeping 7 boys, the whole number masturbated frequently. The act was performed in bed, in the closets, and sometimes in the classrooms during lessons. Inquiry among my friends as to onanism in the boarding schools to which they were sent elicited somewhat contradictory answers concerning the frequency of the habit. Doctor, who went to a French school, told me that all the older boys had younger accomplices in mutual masturbation. He also spoke with experience of the prevalence of the practice in a well-known public school in the west of England. B said all the boys at his school masturbated. J stated that most of his schoolmates were onanists. Roman 50 said more than half was the proportion. At my school, manual masturbation was both solitary and mutual, and sometimes younger boys who had not acquired the habit were induced to manipulate bigger boys. One very precocious boy of 15 always chose a companion of 10 because his hand was like a woman's. Sometimes boys entered their friend's bed for mutual excitement in afterlife. They showed no signs of inversion. Another boy aged about 14 who had been seduced by a servant girl embraced the bolster. The pleasurable sensations, according to his statement, were heightened by imagining that the bolster was a woman. He said that the enjoyment of the act was greatly increased during the holidays when he was able to spread a pair of his sister's drawers upon the pillow and so intensify the illusion. Before puberty, the boys appeared to be more continent than afterward. A few of the older and more intelligent masturbators regulated the habit, as some married men regulate intercourse. The big boy referred to who chose always the same manipulator professed to indulge only once in 20 days, his reason being that more frequent repetition of the act would injure his health. About twice a week for boys who had reached puberty, and once a week for younger boys, was I think about the average indulgence. I have never met with a parallel of one of those cases of excessive masturbation recorded by many doctors. There may have been such cases at this school, but if so, the boys concealed the frequency of their gratifications. My experience proved that many of the lads regarded masturbation as reprehensible, but their plea was everyone does it some. Often those who indulged inordinately and more secretly than their companions gravely condemned the practice as sinful. A few seemed to think there was no harm in it, but that the habit might stunt the growth and weaken the body if practiced very frequently. The greater number made no attempt to conceal the habit. They enlarged upon the pleasure of it. It was ever so much nicer than eating tarts, etc. The chief cause I believe to be initiation by an older schoolmate, but I have known accidental causes, such as the discovery that swarming up a pole pleasurably excited the organ, rubbing to allay irritation, and simple curious handling of the erect penis in the early morning before rising from bed. I quote the foregoing communication as perhaps a fairly typical experience in a British school, though I am myself inclined to think that the prevalence of masturbation in schools is often much overrated. For while in some schools the practice is doubtless rampant, in others it is practically unknown, or at all events only practiced by a few individuals in secret. My own early recollections of private school life fail to yield any reminiscences of any kind connected with either masturbation or homosexuality, and while such happy ignorance may be the exception rather than the rule, I am certainly inclined to believe that owing to race and climate and healthier conditions of life, the sexual impulse is less precocious and less prominently developed during the schoolage in England than in some continental countries. It is probably to this delayed development that we should attribute the contrast that Ferrero finds El Europa Giovine pp. 15156, and certainly states too absolutely, between the sexual reserve of young Englishmen and the sexual immodesty of his own countrymen. In Germany, Nacke has also stated Kritisches zum Kapitel der Sexualität, Archive für Psychiatrie, pp. 35456, 1899, that he heard nothing at school either of masturbation or homosexuality, and he records the experience of medical friends who stated that such phenomena were only rare exceptions, and regarded by the majority of the boys as exhibitions of Schweinerei at other German schools. As Hotch has shown, sexual practices are very prevalent. It is evident that at different schools, and even at the same school at different times, these manifestations vary in frequency within wide limits. Such variations, it seems to me, are due to two causes. In the first place, they largely depend upon the character of the more influential elder boys. In the second place, they depend upon the attitude of the headmaster. With reference to this point, I may quote from a letter written by an experienced master in one of the most famous English public schools. When I first came to a quarter of a century ago, Doctor was making a crusade against this. Failing boys were sent away wholesale. The school was summoned and lectured solemnly. And the more the severities, the more rampant the disease. I thought to myself that the remedy was creating the malady, and I heard afterward from an old boy that in those days they used to talk things over by the fireside and think there must be something very choice in a sin that braved so much. Doctor went, and under we never spoke of such things. Curiosity died down, and the thing itself, I believe, was lessened. We were told to warn new boys of the dangers to health and morals of such offenses, lest the innocent should be caught in ignorance. I have only spoken to a few. I think the great thing is not to put it in boys' heads. I have noticed solitary faults most commonly, and then I tell the boy how he is physically weakening himself. If you notice, it is puppies that seem to go against nature, but grown dogs never. So if two small boys acted thus, I should think it merely an instinctive feeling after nature, which would amend itself. Many here would consider it a heinous sin, but those who think such things sins make them sins. I have seen in the old days most delightful little children sent away, branded with infamy, and scarce knowing why. You might as well expel a boy for scratching his head when it itched. I am sure the soundest way is to treat it as a doctor would, and explain to the boy the physical effects of overindulgence of any sort. When it is combated from the monkish standpoint, the evil becomes an epidemic. I am, however, far from anxious to endorse the policy of ignoring the sexual phenomena of youth. It is not the speaking about such things that should be called in question, but the wisdom and good sense of the speaker. We ought to expect a headmaster to possess both an adequate acquaintance with the nature of the phenomena of autoerotism and homosexuality, and a reasonable amount of tact. Dealing with boys, he may then fairly be trusted to exercise his own judgment. It may be doubted whether boys should be made too alive to the existence of sexual phenomena. There can be no doubt about their teachers. The same is of course true as regards girls, among whom the same phenomena, though less obtrusive, are not less liable to occur. As to whether masturbation is more common in one sex than the other, there have been considerable differences of opinion. Tissot considered it more prevalent among women. Christian believed it commoner among men. Deslandes and Ewan Block hold that there are no sexual differences, and Garnier was doubtful. Lawson Tate, in his Diseases of Women, stated his opinion that in England, while very common among boys, it is relatively rare among women, and then usually taught. Spitzka in America also found it relatively rare among women, and Dana considers it commoner in boys than in girls or adults. Moll is inclined to think that masturbation is less common in women and girls than in the male sex. Rolder believes that after puberty, when it is equally common in both sexes, it is more frequently found in men, but that women masturbate with more passion and imaginative fervor. Kellogg in America says it is equally prevalent in both sexes, but that women are more secretive. Morris, also in America, considers on the other hand that persistent masturbation is commoner in women, and accounts for this by the healthier life and traditions of Bois Pouillet, who studied the matter with considerable thoroughness in France, came to the conclusion that masturbation is commoner among women, among whom he found it to be equally prevalent in rich and poor, and especially so in the great centers of civilization. In Russia, Gutzit states in his Drasig Jar Praxis that from the ages of 10 to 16 boys masturbate more than girls, who know less about the practice, which has not for them the charm of the forbidden. But after 16, he finds the practice more frequent in girls and women than in youths and men. Nacke in Germany believes that there is much evidence pointing in the same direction, and Adler considers masturbation very common in women. Moraglia is decidedly of the opinion, on the ground of his own observations, already alluded to, that masturbation is more frequent among women. He refers to the factor, very significant fact, as I shall elsewhere have to point out, that while in man there is only one sexual center, the penis, in woman there are several centres: clitoris, the vagina, the uterus, the breasts. 309, and he mentions that he knew a prostitute, a well-developed brunette, of somewhat nervous temperament, who boasted that she knew 14 ways of masturbating herself. My own opinion is that the question of the sexual distribution of masturbation has been somewhat obscured by that harmful tendency, to which I have already alluded, to concentrate attention on a particular set of autoerotic phenomena. We must group and divide our facts rationally if we wish to command them. If we confine our attention to very young children, the available evidence shows that the practice is much more common in females, and such a result is in harmony with the fact that precocious puberty is most often found in female children at puberty and adolescence. Occasional or frequent masturbation is common in both boys and girls, though I believe less common than is sometimes supposed. It is difficult to say whether it is more prevalent among boys or girls. One is inclined to conclude that it prevails more widely among boys, the sexual impulse. Consequently, the tendency to masturbation tend to be aroused later and less easily in girls than in youths, though it must also be remembered that boys' traditions and their more active life keep the tendency in abeyance, while in girls there is much less frequently any restraining influence of corresponding character. In my study of inversion, I have found that ignorance and the same absence of tradition are probably factors in the prevalence of homosexual tendencies among women after adolescence. I think there can be no doubt that masturbation is more common in women than in men. Men have by this time mostly adopted some method of sexual gratification with the opposite sex. Women are to a much larger extent shut out from such gratification. Moreover, while in rare cases women are sexually precocious, it more often happens that their sexual impulses only gain strength and self-consciousness after adolescence has passed. I have been much impressed by the frequency with which masturbation is occasionally, especially about the period of menstruation, practiced by active, intelligent, and healthy women who otherwise lead a chaste life. This experience is confirmed by others who are in a position to ascertain the facts among normal people. Thus, a lady who has received the confidence of many women told me that she believes that all women who remain unmarried masturbate, as she found so much evidence pointing in this direction. This statement certainly needs some qualification, though I believe it is not far from the truth as regards young and healthy women who, after having normal sexual relationships, have been compelled for some reason or other to break them off and lead a lonely life. But we have to remember that there are some women, evidently with a considerable degree of congenital sexual anesthesia, no doubt in some respect or another below the standard of normal health, in whom the sexual instinct has never been aroused, and who not only do not masturbate, but do not show any desire for normal gratification, while in a large proportion of other cases, the impulse is gratified passively, in ways I have already referred to, the autoerotic phenomena which take place in this way spontaneously by yielding to reverie with little or no active interference, certainly occur much more frequently in women than in men. On the other hand, contrary to what one might be led to expect, the closely related autoerotic phenomena during sleep seem to take place more frequently in men, although in women, as we have found ground for concluding, they reverberate much more widely and impressively on the waking psychical life. We owe to Restif de la Bretonne what is perhaps the earliest precise description of a woman masturbating in 1755. He knew a dark young woman, plain but well-made, and of warm temperament, educated in a convent. She was observed one day when gazing from her window at a young man in whom she was tenderly interested, to become much excited. Her movements became agitated. I approached her and really believe that she was uttering affectionate expressions. She had become red. Then she sighed deeply and became motionless, stretching out her legs, which she stiffened as if she felt pain. It is further hinted that her hands took part in this maneuver. Monsieur Nicolas Val, Roman 6 p. 143. Pictorial representations of a woman masturbating also occur in 18th-century engravings. Thus in France, Baudouin's Le Midi reproduced in Fuchs, des erotische Element in der Caricature, Fig 92, represents an elegant young lady in a rococo garden boa. She has been reading a book. She has now just dropped together with her sunshade. She leans languorously back, and her hand begins to find its way through her placket hole. Adler, who has studied masturbation in women with more care than any previous writer, has recorded in detail the autoerotic manifestations involved in the case of an intelligent and unprejudiced woman, aged 30, who had begun masturbating when 20, and practiced it at intervals of a few weeks. She experienced the desire for sexual gratification under the following circumstances: 1. Spontaneously directly before or after menstruation. 2. As a method to cure sleeplessness. 3. After washing the parts with warm but not cold water. 4. After erotic dreams. 5. Quite suddenly, without definite cause, the phenomena of the masturbatory process fell into 2 stages. 1. Incomplete excitement. 2. The highest pleasurable gratification. It only took place in the evening or at night, and a special position was necessary, with the right knee bent and the right foot against the knee of the extended left leg. The bent index and middle fingers of the right hand were then applied firmly to the lower third of the left labium minus, which was rubbed against the underlying parts. At this stage, the manifestations sometimes stopped either from an effort of self-control or from fatigue of the arm. There was no emission of mucus or general perspiration, but some degree of satisfaction and of fatigue, followed by sleep. If, however, the manipulation was continued, the second stage was reached, and the middle finger sank into the vagina, while the index finger remained on the labium, the rest of the hand holding and compressing the whole of the vulva from pubis to anus against the symphysis, with a backwards and forwards movement, the left hand also being frequently used to support and assist the right. The parts now gave a mushroom-like feeling to the touch, and in a few seconds or after a longer interval, the complete feeling of pleasurable satisfaction was attained. At the same moment there was, but only after she had had experience of coitus, an involuntary elevation of the pelvis together with emission of mucus, making the hand wet, this mucus having an odor and being quite distinct from the ordinary odorless mucus of the vagina. At the same time, the finger in the vagina felt slight contractions of the whole vaginal wall. The climax of sexual pleasure lasted a few seconds with its concomitant vaginal contractions, then slowly subsided with a feeling of general well-being, the finger at the same time slipping out of the vagina, and she was left in a state of general perspiration, and sleep would immediately follow. When this was not the case, she was frequently conscious of some degree of sensibility in the sacrum lasting for several hours, and especially felt when sitting, when masturbation was the result of an erotic dream, which occurred but seldom. The first stage was already reached in sleep, and the second was more quickly obtained during the act. It was only occasionally that any thoughts of men or of coitus were present, the attention being fixed on the coming climax. The psychic state afterwards was usually one of self-reproach. O. Adler, Die Mangelhaft Geschlechtsempfindung des Weibes, 1904, pp. 26-29. The phenomena in this case may be regarded as fairly typical, but there are many individual variations. Mucus emissions and vaginal contractions frequently occur before actual orgasm, and there is not usually any insertion of the finger into the vagina in women who have never experienced coitus, or indeed even in those who have. We must now turn to that aspect of our subject, which in the past has always seemed the only aspect of autoerotic phenomena meriting attention: the symptoms and results of chronic masturbation. It appears to have been an Englishman who, at the beginning of the 18th century, first called popular attention to the supposed evils of masturbation. His book was published in London and entitled Onania, or the Heinous Sin of Self-Pollution, and all its frightful consequences in both sexes, considered with spiritual and physical advice, etc. It is not a serious medical treatise, but an early and certainly superior example of a kind of literature which we have since become familiar with through the daily newspapers. A large part of the book, which is cleverly written, is devoted in the later editions to the letters of nervous and hypochondriacal young men and women who are too shy to visit the author, but request him to send a bottle of his strengthening tincture and mention that they are enclosing half guinea, a guinea, or still larger sum concerning the composition of the strengthening tincture. We are not informed. This work, which was subsequently attributed to a writer named Beckers, is said to have passed through no less than 80 editions, and it was translated into German. Tissot, a physician of Lausanne, followed with his traité. L'onanisme dissertation sur les maladies produites par la masturbation, first published in Latin 1760, then in French 1764, and afterward, in nearly all European languages, he regarded masturbation as a crime. And as an act of suicide, his book is a production of amusing exaggeration and rhetoric zealously setting forth the prodigious evils of masturbation in a style which combines as Christian remarks the strains of Rousseau with a vein of religious piety. Tissot included only manual self-abuse under the term onanism. Shortly afterward, Voltaire, in his Dictionnaire philosophique, took up the subject, giving it a wider meaning, and still further popularizing it. Finally, Lallement, at a somewhat later period, 1836, wrote a book which was indeed more scientific in character, but which still sought to represent masturbation as the source of all evils. These four rightist author of Onania, Tissot, Voltaire, Lallement, certainly responsible for much the mistaken notions of many medical authorities carried on by tradition even down to our own time. The powerful lever which has been put into the hand of unscrupulous quacks, the suffering dread and remorse experienced in silence by many thousands of ignorant and often innocent young people, may all be traced in large measure back to these four well-meaning, but on this question misguided authors. There is really no end to the list of real or supposed symptoms and results of masturbation, as given by various medical writers during the last century: insanity, epilepsy, numerous forms of eye disease, supraorbital headache, occipital headache, Spitzka, strange sensations at the top of the head, savage, various forms of neuralgia, Anstey, J. Chapman, tenderness of the skin in the lower dorsal region, Chapman, mammary tenderness in young girls, Lakasagny, mammary hypertrophy, Osendowski, asthma, pair, cardiac, murmurs, Searly, the appearance of vesicles on wounds, Baraduc, acne, and other forms of cutaneous eruptions. The author of Onania, Clipson, dilated pupils, Skene, Lewis, Moraglia, eyes directed upward and sideways, Pouillet, dark rings around the eyes, intermittent functional deafness, Bonnier, painful menstruation, J. Chapman, catarrh of uterus and vagina, Winkle, Pouillet, ovarian disease, Jessett, pale and discolored skin, Lewis, Moraglia, redness of nose, Gruner, epistaxis, Joel, J. N. Mackenzie, morbid changes in nose, fleece, convulsive cough of puberty, Gowers, acidity of vagina, R. W. Schufelt, incontinence of urine in young women, Gerando, warts on the hands in women, Der Kreikmer, von Oy, hallucinations of smell and hearing, Griesinger, Lewis, intermittent functional deafness, Bonnier, indican in the urine, Herder, an indescribable odor of the skin in women's skein. These are but a few of the signs and consequences of masturbation given by various prominent authorities. That many of these manifestations do occur in connection with masturbation is unquestionable. There is also good reason to believe that some of them may be the results of masturbation acting on an imperfectly healthy organism. But in all such cases, we must speak with great caution, for there appears to be little reliable evidence to show that simple masturbation in a well-born and healthy individual can produce any evil results beyond slight functional disturbances, and these only when it is practiced in excess. To illustrate the real pathological relationships of masturbation, a few typical and important disorders may be briefly considered. The delicate mechanism of the eye is one of the first portions of the nervous apparatus to be disturbed by any undue strain on the system. It is not surprising that masturbation should be widely incriminated as a cause of eye troubles if, however, we inquire into the results obtained by the most cautious and experienced ophthalmological observers. It grows evident that masturbation as a cause of disease of the eye becomes merged into wider causes. In Germany, Hermann Cohn, the distinguished ophthalmic surgeon of Breslau, has dealt fully with the question. Cohn, who believes that all young men and women masturbate to some extent, finds that masturbation must be excessive for eye trouble to become apparent. In most of his cases, there was masturbation several times daily during from 5 to 7 years, in many during 10 years, and in one during 23 years. In such cases, we are obviously dealing with abnormal persons, and no one will dispute the possibility of harmful results in some of the cases when masturbation was stopped, the eye trouble improved even in these cases. However, the troubles were but slight, the chief being apparently photopsia, a subjective sensation of light, with otherwise normal conditions of pupil vision, color sense, and retina. In some cases, there was photophobia, and he has also found paralysis of accommodation and conjunctivitis at a later date. Salmo Cohn, in his comprehensive monograph on the relationship between the eye and the sexual organs in women, brought together numerous cases of eye troubles in young women associated with masturbation. But in most of these cases, masturbation had been practiced with great frequency for a long period, and the ocular affections were usually not serious. In England, Power has investigated the relations of the sexual system to eye disease. He is inclined to think that the effects of masturbation have been exaggerated, but he believes that it may produce such, for the most part, trivial complaints as photopsis, muscular asthenopia, possibly blepharospasm, and perhaps conjunctivitis. He goes on, however, to point out that more serious complaints of the eye are caused by excess in normal coitus, by sexual abstinence, and especially by disordered menstruation. Thus we see that even when we are considering a mechanism so delicately poised, and one so easily disturbed by any jar of the system as vision, masturbation produces no effect except when carried to an extent which argues a hereditarily imperfect organism, while even in these cases the effects are usually but slight, moreover, in no respect specific, but are paralleled and even exceeded by the results of other disturbances of the sexual system. Let us turn to the supposed influence of masturbation in causing insanity and nervous diseases. Here we may chiefly realize the immense influence exerted on medical science by Tissot and his followers during 100 years. Mental weakness is the cause, and not the result of excessive masturbation, Gall declared. But he was a man of genius in isolation. Sir William Ellis, an alienist of considerable reputation at the beginning of the last century, could write with scientific equanimity, "I have no hesitation in saying that in a very large number of patients in all public asylums, the disease may be attributed to that cause." He does, indeed, admit that it may be only a symptom sometimes, but goes on to assert that masturbation has not hitherto been exhibited in the awful light in which it deserves to be shown, and that in by far the greater number of cases it is the true cause of dementia. Esquirol lent his name and influence to a similar view of the pernicious influence of masturbation throughout the century, even down to the present day. This point of view has been traditionally preserved in a modified form in apparent ignorance of the enormous prevalence of masturbation, and without, so far as can be seen, any attempt to distinguish between cause and effect, or to eliminate the hereditary neuropathic element. Many alienists have set down a large proportion of cases of insanity, idiocy, epilepsy, and disease of the spinal cord to uncomplicated masturbation. Thus, at the Matewan State Hospital, New York, for criminal lunatics and insane prisoners from 1875 to 1907, masturbation was the sole assigned cause of insanity in 160 men out of 2595, while according to Dr. Clara Barris, among 121 cases of insanity in young women, masturbation is the cause in 10 cases. It is unnecessary to multiply examples, for this traditional tendency is familiar to all. It appears to have been largely due to Griesinger in the middle of the last century that we owe the first authoritative appearance of a saner, more discriminating view regarding the results of masturbation, although still, to some extent, fettered by the traditions prevalent in his day. Griesinger saw that it was not so much masturbation itself as the feelings aroused in sensitive minds by the social attitude toward masturbation which produced evil effects. That constant struggle, he wrote, against a desire which is even overpowering, and to which the individual always in the end succumbs, that hidden strife between shame, repentance, good intentions, and the irritation which impels to the act, this, after not a little acquaintance with onanists, we consider to be far more important than the primary direct physical effect. He added that there are no specific signs of masturbation, and concluded that it is oftener a symptom than a cause. The general progress of educated opinions since that date has in the main confirmed and carried forward The results cautiously stated by Griesinger, this distinguished alienist, thought that when practiced in childhood masturbation might lead to insanity. Burkhan, in his investigation of the psychoses of childhood, found that in no single case was masturbation a cause. Vogel, Uffelman, and Emminghaus, in the course of similar studies, have all come to almost similar conclusions. It is only on a congenitally morbid nervous system. Emminghaus insists that masturbation can produce any serious results. Most of the cases charged to masturbation, writes Kiernan in a private letter, basing his opinion on wide clinical experience, are either hebephrenia or hysteria, in which an effect is taken for the cause. Christian, during 20 years' experience in hospitals, asylums, and private practice in town and country, has not found any seriously evil effects from masturbation. He thinks indeed that it may be a more serious evil in women than in men, but Ellis considers that in women it is possibly less exhausting and injurious than in the other sex, which was also the opinion of Hammond as well as of Gutseat, though he found that women pushed the practice much further than men, and Naki, who has given special attention to this point, could not find that masturbation is a definite cause of insanity in women. In a single case, Koch also reaches a similar conclusion as regards both sexes, though he admits that masturbation may cause some degree of psychopathic deterioration, even in this respect. However, he points out that when practiced in moderation, it is not injurious in the an exceptionless way in which it is believed to be in many circles. It is the people whose nervous systems are already injured who masturbate most easily and practice it more immoderately than others. The chief source of its evil is self-reproach, and the struggle with the impulse. Kalbaumit is true under the influence of the older tradition when he erected catatonia into a separate disorder, not always accepted in later times, regarded prolonged and excessive masturbation as a chief cause. But I am not aware that he ever asserted that it was a sole and sufficient cause in a healthy organism. Kiernan, one of the earliest writers on catatonia, was careful to point out that masturbation was probably as much effect as cause of the morbid nervous condition. Maudsley, in Body and Mind, recognized masturbation as a special exciting cause of a characteristic form of insanity, but he cautiously added, nevertheless, I think that self-abuse seldom, if ever, produces it without the cooperation of the insane neurosis. Schul also recognized a specific masturbatory insanity, but the general tendency to reject any such nosological form is becoming marked. Kraft Ebing long since rejected it, and Naki decidedly opposes it. Kriepelin states that excessive masturbation can only occur in a dangerous degree in predisposed subjects, so also Fall and Lowenfeld, as at an earlier period. Trousseau, it is true that Marot, in his admirable and detailed study of the normal and abnormal aspects of puberty, accepts a form of masturbatory insanity, but the only illustrative case he brings forward is a young man possessing various stigmata of degeneracy and the son of an alcoholic father. Such a case tells us nothing regarding the results of simple masturbation. Even Spitzka, who maintained several years ago the traditional views as to the terrible results of masturbation and recognized a special insanity of masturbation, stated his conclusions with a caution that undermined his position. Self-abuse, he concluded, to become a sole cause of insanity must be begun early and carried very far in persons of sound antecedents. It rarely, under these circumstances, suffices to produce an actual vesania, when we remember that there is no convincing evidence to show that masturbation is begun early and carried very far by persons of sound antecedents. The significance of Spitzka's typical psychosis of masturbation is somewhat annulled. It is evident that these distinguished investigators, Marot and Spitzka, have been induced by tradition to take up a position which their own scientific consciences have compelled them practically to evacuate. Recent authorities are almost unanimous in rejecting masturbation as a cause of insanity. Thus Rolder, in his comprehensive monograph, Die Masturbation, 1899, pp. 18,592, although taking a very serious view of the evil results of masturbation, points out the unanimity which is now tending to prevail on this point, and lays it down that masturbation is never the direct cause of insanity. Sexual excesses of any kind, he adds following Kirschman, can at the most merely give an impetus to a latent form of insanity on the whole. He concludes the best authorities are unanimous in agreeing that masturbation may certainly injure mental capacity by weakening memory and depressing intellectual energy, that further in hereditarily neurotic subjects, it may produce slight psychoses like folie du doubt hypochondria. Hysteria that finally under no circumstances can it produce severe psychoses like paranoia or general paralysis. If it caused insanity as often as some claim, as Kellogg remarks, the whole race would long since have passed into masturbatic degeneracy of mind. It is especially injurious in the very young and in all who have weak nervous systems, but the physical traits attributed to the habit are common to thousands of neurasthenic and neurotic individuals. Kellogg, A Textbook of Mental Diseases, 1897, pp. 94-95. Again, at the outset of the article on masturbation in Tuke's Dictionary of Psychological Medicine, Ellis states that on account of the mischief formerly done by reckless statements, it is necessary to state plainly that unless the practice has been long and greatly indulged, no permanent evil effects may be observed to follow. Nacke again has declared Kritisches zum Kapitel der Sexualität, Archive für Psychiatrie, 1899, there are neither somatic nor psychic symptoms peculiar on onanism, nor is there any specific onanistic psychosis. I am prepared to deny that onanism ever produces any psychoses in those who are not already predisposed. That such a view is now becoming widely prevalent is illustrated by the cautious and temperate discussion of masturbation in a recent work by a non-medical writer, Jeffrey Mortimer, Chapters on Human Love, pp. 199,205. The testimony of expert witnesses with regard to the influence of masturbation in producing other forms of psychoses and neuroses is becoming equally decisive, and here also the traditions of Tissot are being slowly effaced. I have not, in the whole of my practice, wrote West 40 years ago, out of a large experience among children and women, seen convulsions, epilepsy, or idiocy induced by masturbation in any child of either sex. Neither have I seen any instance in which hysteria, epilepsy, or insanity in women after puberty was due to masturbation, as its efficient cause. Gowers speaks somewhat less positively, but regards masturbation as not so much a cause of true epilepsy as of atypical attacks, sometimes of a character intermediate between the hysteroid and the epileptoid form. This relationship he has frequently seen in boys laden among the causes of diseases of the spinal cord, does not include any form of sexual excess in moderation. Erb remarks masturbation is not more dangerous to the spinal cord than natural coitus, and has no bad effects. It makes no difference. Erb considers whether the orgasm is effected normally or in solitude. This is also the opinion of Toulouse, of Furbringer, and of Kirschman, as at an earlier period it was of Raubaud. While these authorities are doubtless justified in refusing to ascribe to masturbation any part in the production of psychic or nervous diseases, it seems to me that they are going somewhat beyond their province when they assert that masturbation has no more injurious effect than coitus. If sexual coitus were a purely physiological phenomenon, this position would be sound, but the sexual orgasm is normally bound up with a mass of powerful emotions aroused by a person of the opposite sex. It is in the joy caused by the play of these emotions, as well as in the discharge of the sexual orgasm, that the satisfaction of coitus resides. In the absence of the desired partner, the orgasm, whatever relief it may give, must be followed by a sense of dissatisfaction, perhaps of depression, even of exhaustion, often of shame and remorse. The same remark has since been made by Stanley Hall, practically also. As John Hunter pointed out, there is more probability of excess in masturbation than in coitus, whether, as some have asserted, masturbation involves a greater nervous effort than coitus is more doubtful. It thus seems somewhat misleading to assert that masturbation has no more injurious effect than coitus. Reviewing the general question of the supposed grave symptoms and signs of masturbation and its pernicious results, we may reach the conclusion that in the case of moderate masturbation in healthy, well-born individuals, no seriously pernicious results necessarily follow. With regard to the general signs, we may accept as concerns both sexes what the Obstetrical and Gynecological Society of Berlin decided in 1861, in a discussion of it in women, that there are none which can be regarded as reliable. We may conclude finally with Clouston that the opposing views on the subject may be simply explained by the fact that the writers on both sides have ignored or insufficiently recognized the influence of heredity and temperament. They have done precisely what so many unscientific writers on inebriety have continued to do unto the present day when describing the terrible results of alcohol, without pointing out that the chief factor in such cases has not been the alcohol, but the organization on which the alcohol acted. Excess may act according to the familiar old-fashioned adage like the lighted match, but we must always remember the obvious truth that it makes a considerable difference whether you threw your lighted match into a powder magazine or into the sea. While we may thus dismiss the extravagant views widely held during the past century concerning the awful results of masturbation as due to ignorance and false tradition, it must be pointed out that even in healthy or moderately healthy individuals, any excess in solitary self-excitement may still produce results which, though slight, are yet harmful. The skin, digestion, and circulation may all be disordered, headache and neuralgia may occur, and as in normal sexual excess or in undue frequency of sexual excitement during sleep, there is a certain general lowering of nervous tone, probably the most important of the comparatively frequent results, though this also arises usually on a somewhat morbid soiles neurasthenia with its manifold symptoms. There can be little doubt that the ancient belief dating from the time of Hippocrates that sexual excesses produce spinal disease, as well as the belief that masturbation causes insanity, are largely due to the failure to diagnose neurasthenia. The following case of neurasthenia recorded by Eulenberg may be given as a classical picture of the nervous disturbances which may be associated with masturbation and are frequently regarded as solely caused by habits of masturbation. Miss H, 28 years of age, a robust brunette with fully developed figure without any trace of anemia or chlorosis, but with an apathetic expression, bluish rings around the eyes, with hypochondriacal and melancholy feelings. She complains of pressure on the head as if head would burst, giddiness, ringing in the ears, photopsia, hemicrania, pains in the back, and at sacrum and symptoms of spinal adynamia, with a sense of fatigue on the least exertion in walking or standing. She sways when standing with closed eyes, tendon reflexes exaggerated. There is a sense of oppression, intercostal neuralgia, and all the signs of neurasthenic dyspepsia and cardialgia, nausea, flatulence, meteorism, and alternate constipation and diarrhea. She chiefly complains of a feeling of weight and pain in the abdomen caused by the slightest movement, and of a form of pollution with clitoridian spasms, especially near menstruation, with copious flow of mucus, characteristic pains, and hyperexcitability. Menstruation was irregular and profuse. Examination showed tumid and elongated nymph with brown pigmentation, rather large vagina with rudimentary hymen and retroflexion of uterus. After much persuasion, the patient confessed that when a girl of 12, and as the result of repeated attempts at coitus by a boy of 16, she had been impelled to frequent masturbation. This had caused great shame and remorse, which however had not sufficed to restrain the habit. Her mother having died, she lived alone with her invalid father, and had no one in whom to confide regarding herself. As no longer a virgin, she had refused several offers of marriage, and thus still further aggravated her mental condition. Eulenberg, Sexual Neuropathy, p. 31. Since Beard first described neurasthenia, many diverse opinions have been expressed concerning the relationships of sexual irregularities to neurasthenia. Gilles de la Tourette, in his little monograph on neurasthenia, following the traditions of Charcot's school, dismisses the question of any sexual causation without discussion by Swanger die Pathologie und Therapie der Neurasthenie, while admitting that nearly all neurasthenic persons acknowledge masturbation at some period. Considers it is not an important cause of neurasthenia, only differing from coitus by the fact that the opportunities for it are more frequent, and that the sexual disturbances of neurasthenia are in the majority of cases secondary. Rolder, on the other hand, who takes a very grave view of the importance of masturbation, considers that its most serious results are a question of neurasthenia. Kraft, Ebbing, has declared his opinion that masturbation is a cause of neurasthenia. Christian. Leyden, Erb, Rosenthal, Beard, Hummel, Hammond, Herman, Cohn, Kirschmann, Saville, Herman, Furbringer all attach chief importance to neurasthenia as a result of masturbation. Collins and Philip, Medical Record, March 25, 1899, in an analysis of 333 cases of neurasthenia, found that 123 cases were apparently due to overwork or masturbation. Freud concludes that neurasthenia proper can nearly always be traced to excessive masturbation or to spontaneous pollutions, for example Sammlung Kleiner, Schriffen zur Neurosenlehre, first series, p. 187. This view is confirmed by Gattel's careful study über die sexuellen Ursachen der Neurasthenie und Angstneurose, 1898. Gattel investigated 100 consecutive cases of severe functional nervous disorder in Kraft-Ebing's clinic at Vienna, and found that in every case of neurasthenia, in a male 28 in all, there was masturbation, while of the 15 women with neurasthenia, only one is recorded as not masturbating, and she practiced coitus reservatus irrespective of the particular form of the nervous disorder. Gattel found that 18 women out of 42 and 36 men out of 58 acknowledged masturbation. This shows a slightly larger proportion among the men, but the men were mostly young, while the women were mostly of more mature age. It must, however, always be remembered that we have no equally careful statistics of masturbation in perfectly healthy persons. We must also remember that we have to distinguish between the post and the propter, and that it is quite possible that neurasthenic persons are specially predisposed to masturbation. Bloch is of this opinion and remarks that a vicious circle may thus be formed. On the whole, there can be little doubt that neurasthenia is liable to be associated with masturbation, carried to an excessive extent, but while neurasthenia is probably the severest affection that is liable to result from or accompany masturbation, we are scarcely yet entitled to accept the conclusion of Gattel that in such cases there is no hereditary neurotic predisposition. We must steer clearly between the opposite errors of those, on the one hand, who assert that heredity is the sole cause of functional nervous disorders, and those, on the other hand, who consider that the incident that may call out the disorder is itself a sole sufficient cause. In many cases, it has seemed to me that masturbation, when practiced in excess, especially if begun before the age of puberty, leads to inaptitude for coitus, as well as to indifference to it, and sometimes to undue sexual irritability involving premature emission and practical impotence. This is, however, the exception, especially if the practice has not been begun until after puberty. In women, I attach considerable importance, as a result of masturbation, to an aversion for normal coitus in later life. In such cases, some peripheral irritation or abnormal mental stimulus trains the physical sexual orgasm to respond to an appeal which has nothing whatever to do with the fascination normally exerted by the opposite sex at puberty. However, the claim of passion and the real charm of sex begin to make themselves felt, but owing to the physical sexual feelings having been trained into a foreign channel, these new and more normal sex associations remain of a purely ideal and emotional character without the strong sensual impulses with which, under healthy conditions, they tend to be more and more associated as puberty passes on into adolescence or mature adult life. I am fairly certain that in many women, often highly intellectual women, the precocious excess in masturbation has been a main cause, not necessarily the sole efficient cause, in producing a divorce in later life between the physical sensuous impulses and the ideal emotions, the sensuous impulse having been evolved and perverted before the manifestation of the higher emotion. The two groups of feelings have become divorced for the whole of life. This is a common source of much personal misery and family unhappiness, though at the same time, the clash of contending impulses may lead to a high development of moral character. When early masturbation is a factor in producing sexual inversion, it usually operates in the manner I have here indicated, the repulsion for normal coitus helping to furnish a soil on which the inverted impulse may develop unimpeded. This point has not wholly escaped previous observers, though they do not seem to have noted its psychological mechanism. Tissot stated that masturbation causes an aversion to marriage More recently, Leumann über Onanismus beim Weib, therapeutisch Monatschaft, April 1890, considered that masturbation in women leading to a perversion of sexual feeling, including inability to find satisfaction in coitus, affects the associated centers. Smith-Baker again. Neuropsychical element in Conjugal Aversion, Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, September 1892, finds that a source of marital aversion seems to lie in the fact that substitution of mechanical and iniquitous excitations affords more thorough satisfaction than the mutual legitimate ones do, and gives cases in point. Saville, also, who believes that masturbation is more common in women than is usually supposed, regards dyspareunia or pain in coition as one of the signs of the habit. Masturbation in women thus becomes, as Raymond and Janet point out, less obsessions, Vol. Roman 2 p. 307, a frequent cause of sexual frigidity in marriage. These authors illustrate the train of evils, which may thus be set up by the case of a lady 26 years of age, a normal woman of healthy family, who at the age 15 was taught by a servant to masturbate. At the age of 18, she married, she loved her husband, but she had no sexual feelings in coitus, and she continued to masturbate, sometimes several times a day, without evil consequences. At 24, she had to go into a hospital for floating kidney and was so obliged to stop masturbating. She here accidentally learnt of the evil results attributed to the habit. She resolved not to do it again, and she kept her resolution. But while still in hospital, she fell wildly in love with a man. To escape from the constant thought of this man, she sought relations with her husband, and at times masturbated, but now it no longer gave her pleasure. She wished to give up sexual things altogether. But that was easier said than done. She became subject to nervous crises, often brought on by the sight of a man, and accompanied by sexual excitement. They disappeared under treatment, and she thereupon became entirely frigid sexually. But far from being happy, she has lost all energy and interest in life, and it is her sole desire to attain the sexual feelings she has lost. Adler considers that even when masturbation in women becomes an overmastering passion, so far as organic effects are concerned, it is usually harmless, its effects being primarily psychic, and he attaches a special significance to it as a cause of sexual anesthesia in normal coitus, being perhaps the most frequent cause of such anesthesia. He devotes an important chapter to this matter and brings forward numerous cases in illustration. Adler, Die Mangelhaft, Geschlechtliche Empfindung des Weibes, pp. 93,119. Also 2123, Adler considers that the frequency of masturbation in women is largely due to the fact that women experience greater difficulties than men in obtaining sexual satisfaction, and so are impelled by unsatisfying coitus to continue masturbation after marriage. He adds that partly from natural shyness, partly from shame of acknowledging what is commonly accounted a sin, and partly from the fear of seeming disgusting or unworthy of sympathy in the doctor's eyes, women are usually silent on this matter, and very great tact and patience may be necessary before a confession is obtained. On the psychic side, no doubt the most frequent and the most characteristic result of persistent and excessive masturbation is a morbid heightening of self-consciousness, without any coordinated heightening of self-esteem. The man or woman who is kissed by a desirable and desired person of the opposite sex feels a satisfying sense of pride and elation, which must always be absent from the manifestations of autoerotic activity. This must be so even apart from the masturbator's consciousness of the general social attitude toward his practices and his dread of detection, for that may also exist as regards normal coitus, without any corresponding psychic affects. The masturbator, if his practice is habitual, is thus compelled to cultivate an artificial consciousness of self-esteem, and may show a tendency to mental arrogance. Self-righteousness and religiosity constitute, as it were, a protection against the tendency to remorse. A morbid mental soil is of course required for the full development of these characteristics. The habitual male masturbator, it must be remembered, is often a shy and solitary person. Individuals of this temperament are especially predisposed to excesses in all the manifestations of autoerotism, while the yielding to such tendencies increases the reserve and the horror of society, at the same time producing a certain suspicion of others. In some extreme cases, There is no doubt, as Kripalin believes, some decrease of psychic capacity, an inability to grasp and coordinate external impressions, weakness of memory, deadening of emotions, or else the general phenomena of increased irritability leading on to neurasthenia. I find good reason to believe that in many cases the psychic influence of masturbation on women is different from its effect on men, as Spitzker observed. Although it may sometimes render women self-reproachful and hesitant, it often seems to make them bold boys, as we have seen early assimilate the tradition that self-abuse is unmanly and injurious, but girls have seldom any corresponding tradition that it is unwomanly, and thus whether or not they are reticent on the matter before the forum of their own conscience, they are often less ashamed of it than men are and less troubled by remorse. Eulenberg considers that the comparative absence of bad effects from masturbation in girls is largely due to the fact that, unlike boys, they are not terrorized by exaggerated warnings and quack literature concerning the awful results of the practice. Who has also remarked that women are often comparatively little troubled by qualms of conscience after masturbation, denies that this is due to a lower moral tone than men possess. Die Sexualfrage, p. 247. In this connection, I may refer to History Roman 4, recorded in the appendix to the 5th volume of these studies, in which it is stated that of 55 prostitutes of various nationalities with whom the subject had had relations, 18 spontaneously told him that they were habitual masturbators, while of 26 normal women, 13 made the same confession unasked. Gutseat in Russia, after stating that women of good constitution had told him that they masturbated as much as 6 or 10 times a day or night, until they fell asleep tired, without bad results, adds that according to his observations masturbation, when not excessive, is on the whole a quite innocent matter, which exerts little or no permanent effect, and adds that it never in any case leads to hypochondria onanica in women, because they have not been taught to expect bad results. Dreisig, Jar Praxis, p. 306. There is, I think, some truth, though the exceptions are doubtless many, in the distinction drawn by W. Roman 100 Cross Masturbational Neuroses. Medical News, July 13, 1901. From my experience, masturbation seems to have an opposite effect upon the two sexes, dulling the mental and making clumsy the physical exertions of the male, while in the female it quickens and excites the physical and psychical movements. The man is rendered hypoaesthetic, the woman hyperesthetic. In either sex, autoerotic excesses during adolescence in young men and women of intelligence the absence of gross injury, there may be still often produce a certain degree of psychic perversion, and tend to foster false and high-strung ideals of life. Kripalin refers to the frequency of exalted enthusiasms in masturbators, and I have already quoted Anstey's remarks on the connection between masturbation and premature false work in literature and art. It may be added that excess in masturbation has often occurred in men and women whose work in literature and art cannot be described as premature and false. K.P. Moritz, in early adult life, gave himself up to excess in masturbation, and up to the age of 30 had no relations with women. Lernout is said, though the statement is sometimes denied, to have been a masturbator from early life, the habit profoundly affecting his life and work. Rousseau, in his Confessions, admirably describes how his own solitary, timid, and imaginative life found its chief sexual satisfaction in masturbation. Gogol, the great Russian novelist, masturbated to excess, and it has been suggested that the dreamy melancholy thus induced was a factor in his success as a novelist. Goethe, it has been asserted, at one time masturbated to excess. I am not certain on what authority the statement is made, probably on a passage in the 7th book of Dichtung und Wahrheit, in which, describing his student life at Leipzig and his loss of Inchen owing to his neglect of her, he tells how he revenged that neglect on his own physical nature by foolish practices from which he thinks he suffered for a considerable period. The great Scandinavian philosopher Soren Kierkegaard suffered severely, according to Rasmussen, from excessive masturbation. That at the present day eminence in art, literature, and other fields may be combined with the excessive practice of masturbation is a fact of which I have unquestionable evidence. I have the detailed history of a man of 30 of high ability in a scientific direction, who, except during periods of mental strain, has practiced masturbation nightly, though seldom more than once a night, from early childhood, without any traceable results so far as his general health and energy are concerned. In another case, a schoolteacher aged 30, a hard worker, an accomplished musician, has masturbated every night, sometimes more than once a night, ever since he was at school, without, so far as he knows, any bad results. He has never had connection with a woman, and seldom touches wine or tobacco. Kirschman knew a young and able author who from the age of 11 had masturbated excessively, but who retained physical and mental freshness. It would be very easy to refer to other examples, and I may remark that as regards the histories recorded in various volumes of these studies, a notable proportion of those in which excessive masturbation is admitted are of persons of eminent and recognized ability. It is often possible to trace the precise mechanism of the relationship between autoerotic excitement and intellectual activity. Brown Sequard, in Old Age, considered that to induce a certain amount of sexual excitement not proceeding to emission was an aid to mental work. Raymond and Janet knew a man, considering himself a poet, who, in order to attain the excitation necessary to compose his ideal verses, would write with one hand, while with the other he caressed his penis, though not to the extent of producing ejaculation. We must not believe, however, that this is by any means the method of workers who deserve to be accepted seriously. It would be felt, to say the least, as unworthy. It is indeed a method that would only appeal to a person of feeble or failing mental power. What more usually happens is that the autoerotic excitement develops pari passu and spontaneously with the mental activity, and at the climax of the latter, the autoerotic excitement also culminates almost or even quite spontaneously in an explosion of detumescence, which relieves the mental tension. I am acquainted with such cases in both young men and women of intellectual ability, and they probably occur much more frequently than we usually suspect. In illustration of the foregoing observations, I may quote the following narrative written by a man of letters from puberty to the age of 30. When I married, I lived in virgin continence. In accord with my principle during these years, I worked exceedingly hard, chiefly at art, music, and poetry, my days being spent earning my livelihood. These art studies fell into my evening time. I noticed that productive power came in periods of irregular length, and which certainly to a partial extent could be controlled by the will. Such a period of vital power began usually with a sensation of melancholy, and it quickened my normal revolt against the narrowness of conventional life into a red-hot detestation of the paltriness and pettiness with which so many mortals seem to content themselves. As the mood grew in intensity, this scorn of the lower things mixed with and gave place to a vivid insight into higher truths. The oppression began to give place to a realization of the eternity of the heroic things. The fatuities were seen as mere fashions. Love was seen as the true lord of life. The eternal romance was evident in its glory. The naked strength and beauty of men were known despite their clothes. In such mood my work was produced. Bitter protest and keen-sighted passion mingled in its building. The arising vitality had certainly deep relation to the periodicity of the sex force of manhood. At the height of the power of the art-creative mood would come those natural emissions with which nature calmly disposes of the unused force of the male. Such emissions were natural and healthy, and not exhaustive or hysterical. The process is undoubtedly sane and protective. Unless the subject be unhealthy, the period of creative art power extended a little beyond the end of the period of natural seed emission. The artwork of this last stage being less vibrant and of a gentler force, then followed a time of calm natural rest, which gradually led up to the next sequence of melancholy and power. The period certainly varied in length of time, controlled somewhat by the force of the mind and the mental will to create. That is to say, I could somewhat delay the natural emission, by which I gained an extension of the period of power. How far masturbation in moderately healthy persons living without normal sexual relationships may be considered normal is a difficult question, only to be decided with reference to individual cases. As a general rule, when only practiced at rare intervals and faute de mieux, in order to obtain relief for physical oppression and mental obsession, it may be regarded as the often inevitable result of the unnatural circumstances of our civilized social life, when, as often happens in mental degeneracy and, as in shy and imaginative persons, perhaps of neurotic temperament, may also sometimes become the cassate is practiced in preference to sexual relationships, it at once becomes abnormal and may possibly lead to a variety of harmful results, mental and physical. It must always be remembered, however, that while the practice of masturbation may be harmful in its consequences, it is also in the absence of normal sexual relationships, frequently not without good results. In the medical literature of the last 100 years, a number of cases have been incidentally recorded in which the patients found masturbation beneficial, and such cases might certainly have been enormously increased if there had been any open-eyed desire to discover them. My own observations agree with those of Sudduth, who asserts that masturbation is in the main practiced for its sedative effect on the nervous system. The relaxation that follows the act constitutes its real attraction. Both masturbation and sexual intercourse should be classed as typical sedatives. Gall Functions du Cerveau 1825 Vol Roman 3 p. 235 mentioned a woman who was tormented by strong sexual desire, which she satisfied by masturbation 10 or 12 times a day. This caused no bad results and led to the immediate disappearance of a severe pain in the back of the neck, from which she often suffered. Clouston Mental Diseases 1887 p. 496 quotes as follows from a letter written by a youth of 22. I am sure I cannot explain myself nor give account of such conduct. Sometimes I felt so uneasy at my work that I would go to the water closet to do it, and it seemed to give me ease, and then I would work like a hatter for a whole week, till the sensation overpowered me again. I have been the most filthy scoundrel in existence, etc. Garnier presents the case of a monk aged 33 living a chaste life who wrote the following account of his experiences. For the past 3 years at least, I have felt every 2 or 3 weeks a kind of fatigue in the penis, or rather slight shooting pains, increasing during several days. And then I feel a strong desire to expel the semen, when no nocturnal pollution follows. The retention of the semen causes general disturbance, headache, and sleeplessness. Must confess that occasionally, to free myself from the general and local oppression, I lie on my stomach and obtain ejaculation. I am at once relieved, a weight seems to be lifted from my chest, and sleep returns. This patient consulted Gamia as to whether this artificial relief was not more dangerous than the sufferings it relieved. Gamia advised that if the ordinary regime of a well-ordered monastery together with anaphrodisiac sedatives proved inefficacious, the maneuver might be continued when necessary. P. Garnier, Celibat et Celibataires, 1887 p. 320, H. Roman 100, Co-American Journal of Obstetrics, p. 766, July 1889, gives the case of a married lady who was deeply sensitive of the wrong nature of masturbation, but found in it the only means of relieving the severe ovarian pain associated with intense sexual excitement, which attended menstruation during the intermenstrual period. The temptation was absent. Turnbull knew a youth who found that masturbation gave great relief to feelings of heaviness and confusion, which came on him periodically, and Wigglesworth has frequently seen masturbation after epileptic fits in patients who never masturbated at other times. Mal libido. Sexualis BD IP 13 refers to a woman of 28, an artist of nervous and excitable temperament, who could not find sexual satisfaction with her lover, but only when masturbating, which she did once or twice a day or oftener. Without masturbation, she said she would be in a much more nervous state. A friend tells me of a married lady of 40 separated from her husband on account of incompatibility, who suffered from irregular menstruation. She tried masturbation, and in her own words became normal again. She had never masturbated previously. I have also been informed of the case of a young unmarried woman, intellectual, athletic, and well-developed, who from the age of 7 or 8 has masturbated nearly every night before going to sleep, and would be restless and unable to sleep if she did not. Judging from my own observations among both sexes, I should say that in normal persons well past the age of puberty, and otherwise leading a chaste life, masturbation would be little practiced, except for the physical and mental relief it brings. Many vigorous and healthy unmarried women, or married women, apart from their husbands living a life of sexual abstinence, have asserted emphatically that only by sexually exciting themselves at intervals could they escape from a condition of nervous oppression and sexual obsession, which they felt to be a state of hysteria. In most cases, this happens about the menstrual period, and whether accomplished as a purely physical act in the same way as they would soothe a baby to sleep by rocking it or patting it by the cooperation of voluptuous mental imagery, the practice is not cultivated for its own sake during the rest of them. In illustration of the foregoing statements, I will here record a few typical observations of experiences with regard to masturbation. The cases selected are all women and are all in a fairly normal, and for the most part excellent state of health. Some of them, however, belong to somewhat neurotic families, and these are persons of unusual mental ability and intelligence. Observation Roman 1 unmarried, aged 38. She is very vigorous and healthy, of a strongly passionate nature, but never masturbated until a few years ago when she was made love to by a man who used to kiss her, etc. Although she did not respond to these advances, she was thrown into a state of restless sexual excitement on one occasion when in bed. In this restless state, she accidentally found on passing a hand over her body that by playing with a round thing, clitoris, a pleasurable feeling was produced. She found herself greatly relieved and quieted by these manipulations, though there remained a feeling of tiredness afterward. She has sometimes masturbated 6 times in a night, especially before and after the menstrual period, until she was unable to produce the orgasm or any feeling of pleasure. Observation Roman 2 unmarried, aged 45, of rather nervous temperament. She has for many years been accustomed, usually about a week before the appearance of the menses, to obtain sexual relief by kicking out her legs. When lying down in this way, she says, she obtains complete satisfaction. She never touches herself on the following day. She frequently has pains over the lower part of the abdomen, such pains being apparently muscular and due to the exertion. Observation Roman 3 aged 29, recently married, belonging to a neurotic and morbid family, herself healthy and living, usually in the country, vivacious, passionate, enthusiastic, intellectual, and taking a prominent part in philanthropic schemes and municipal affairs, at the same time fond of society, and very attractive to men. For many years she had been accustomed to excite herself, though she felt it was not good for her. The habit was merely practiced faute de mieux. I used to sit on the edge of the bed sometimes, she said, and it came over me so strongly that I simply couldn't resist it. I felt that I should go mad, and I thought it was better to touch myself than be insane. I used to press my clitoris in it, made me very tired afterward, not like being with my husband. The confession was made from a conviction of the importance of the subject, and with the hope that some way might be found out of the difficulties which so often beset women. Observation Roman 4 unmarried, aged 27, possesses much force of character and high intelligence, is actively engaged in a professional career. As a child of 7 or 8, she began to experience what she describes as lightning-like sensations, mere vague uneasy feelings or momentary twitches, which took place alike in the vulva or the vagina or the uterus, not amounting to an orgasm, and nothing like it. These sensations, it should be added, have continued into adult life. I always experience them just before menstruation and afterward for a few days, and occasionally, though it seems to me not so often during the period itself, I may have the sensation 4 or 5 times during the day. It is not dependent at all upon external impressions or my own thoughts, and is sometimes absent for days together. It is just one flash, as if you would snap your fingers, and it is over. As a child, she was of course quite unconscious that there was anything sexual in these sensations. They were then usually associated with various imaginary scenes. The one usually indulged in was that a black bear was waiting for her up in a tree, and that she was slowly raised up toward the bear by means of ropes, and then lowered again and raised, feeling afraid of being caught by the bear, and yet having a morbid desire to be caught. In after years, she realized that there was a physical sexual cause underlying these imaginations, and that what she liked was a feeling of resistance to the bear, giving rise to the physical sensation. At a somewhat later age, though while still a child, she cherished an ideal passion for a person very much older than herself, this passion absorbing her thoughts for a period of 2 years, during which, however, there was no progress made in physical sensation. It was when she was nearly 13 years of age, soon after the appearance of menstruation, and under the influence of this ideal passion, that she first learned to experience conscious orgasm, which was not associated with the thought of any person. I did not associate it with anything high or beautiful, owing to the fact that I had imbibed our current ideas in regard to sexual feelings, and viewed them in a very poor light. Indeed, she considers that her sexual feelings were stronger at this period than at any other time in her life. She could, however, often deny herself physical satisfaction for weeks at a time, in order that she might not feel unworthy of the object of her ideal passion. As for the sexual satisfaction, she writes, "It was experimental. I had heard older girls speak of the pleasure of such feelings, but I was not taught anything by example or otherwise. I merely rubbed myself with the washrag while bathing, waiting for a result, and having the same peculiar feeling I had so often experienced. I am not aware of any ill effects having resulted, but I felt degraded and tried hard to overcome the habit. No one had spoken to me of the habit, but from the secrecy of grown people and passages I had heard from the Bible, I conceived the idea that it was a reprehensible practice. And while this did not curb my desire, it taught me self-control, and I vowed that each time should be the last. I was often able to keep the resolution for 2 or 3 weeks. Some 4 years later, she gradually succeeded in breaking herself of the practice, in so far as it had become a habit. She has, however, acquired a fuller knowledge of sexual matters, and though she has still a great dread of masturbation as a vice, she does not hesitate to relieve her physical feelings when it seems best to her to do so. I am usually able to direct my thoughts from these sensations," she writes. "But if they seem to make me irritable or wakeful, I relieve myself. It is a physical act unassociated with deep feeling of any kind. I have always felt that it was a rather unpleasant compromise with my physical nature, but certainly necessary in my case. Yet I have abstained from gratification for very long periods. If the feeling is not strong at the menstrual period, I go on very well without either the sensation or the gratification, until the next period, and strange as it may seem, the best antidote I have found, and the best preventive, is to think about spiritual things, or someone whom I love. It is simply a matter of training, I suppose, a sort of mental gymnastics which draws the attention away from the physical feelings. This lady has never had any sexual relationships, and since she is ambitious and believes that the sexual emotions may be transformed so as to become a source of motive power throughout the whole of life, she wishes to avoid such relationships." Observation Roman 5, unmarried, aged 31, in good health, with however a somewhat hysterical excess of energy when I was about 26 years of age. She writes, "A friend came to me with the confession that for several years she had masturbated and had become such a slave to the habit that she severely suffered from its ill effects. At that time, I had never heard of self-abuse by women. I listened to her story with much sympathy and interest, but some skepticism, and determined to try experiments upon myself with the idea of getting to understand the matter in order to assist my friend. After some manipulation, I succeeded in awakening what had before been unconscious and unknown. I purposely allowed the habit to grow upon me, and one night I always operated upon myself before going to sleep. Never in the morning I obtained considerable pleasurable satisfaction, but the following day my conscience awoke. I also felt pain located at the back of my head, and down the spinal column. I ceased my operations for a time, and then began again somewhat regularly, once a month, a few days after menstruation. During those months in which I exercised moderation, I think I obtained much local relief, with comparatively little injury, but later on, finding myself in robust health, I increased my experiments. The habit grew upon me, and it was only with an almost superhuman effort that I broke myself free. Needless to say that I gave no assistance to my suffering friend, nor did I ever refer to the subject after her confession to me. Some 2 years later, I heard of sexual practices between women as a frequent habit in certain quarters. I again interested myself in masturbation, for I had been told something that led me to believe that there was much more for me to discover. Not knowing the most elementary physiology, I questioned some of my friends, and then commenced again. I restricted myself to relief from local congestion and irritation by calling forth the emission of mucus, rather than by seeking pleasure. At the same time, I sought to discover what manipulation of the clitoris would lead to. The habit grew upon me with startling rapidity, and I became more or less its slave, but I suffered from no very great ill effects until I started in search of more discoveries. I found that I was a complete ignoramus as to the formation of a woman's body, and by experiments upon myself sought to discover the vagina. I continued my operations until I obtained an entrance. I think the rough handling of myself during this final stage disturbed my nervous system and caused me considerable pain and exhaustion at the back of my head, the spinal column, the back of my eyes, and a general feeling of languor, etc. I could not bear to be the slave of a habit, and after much suffering and efforts, which only led to falls to lower depths of conscious failure, my better self rebelled, until by a great effort and much prayer, I kept myself pure for a whole week. This partial recovery gave me hope. But then I again fell a victim to the habit, much to my chagrin, and became hopeless of ever retracing my steps toward my ideal of virtue. For some days, I lost energy, spirit, and hope. My nervous system appeared to be ruined, but I did not really despair of victory in the end. I thought of all the drunkards chained by their intemperate habits, of inveterate smokers who could not exist without tobacco, and of all the various methods by which men were slaves, and the longing to be freed of what had, in my case, proved to be a painful and unnecessary habit increased daily, until after one night, when I struggled with myself for hours, I believed I had finally succeeded. At times when I reached a high degree of sexual excitement, I felt that I was at least one step removed from those of morbid and repressed sex who had not the slightest suspicion of the latent joys of womanhood within them. For a little while, the habit took the shape of an exalted passion, but I rapidly tired it out by rough, thoughtless, and too impatient handling. Revulsion set in with the pain of an exhausted and badly used nervous system, and finding myself the slave of a passion, I determined to endeavor to be its master. In conclusion, I should say that masturbation has proved itself to be, to me, one of the blind turnings of my life's history, from which I have gained much valuable experience. The practice was, however, by no means thus dismissed. Some time later, the subject writes, I have again restarted masturbation for the relief of localized feelings. One morning, I was engaged in reading a very heavy volume, which for convenience sake I held in my lap, leaning back on my chair. I had become deep in my study for an hour or so when I became aware of certain feelings roused by the weight of the book. Being tempted to see what would happen by such conduct, I shifted so that the edge of the volume came in closer contact. The pleasurable feelings increased, so I gave myself up to my emotions for some 30 minutes. Notwithstanding the intense pleasure I enjoyed for so long a period, I maintain that it is wiser to refrain, and although I admit in the same breath that by gentle treatment such pleasure may be harmless to the general health, it does lead to a desire for solitude which is not conducive to a happy frame of mind. There is an accompanying reticence of speech concerning the pleasure, which therefore appears to be unnatural, like the eating of stolen fruit. After such an event, one seems to require to fly to the woods and to listen to the song of the birds so as to shake off after effects. In a letter dated some months later, she writes, I think I have risen above the masturbation habit. In the same letter, the writer remarks, if I had consciously abnormal or unsatisfied appetites, I would satisfy them in the easiest and least harmful way. Again, 18 months later, she writes, it is curious to note that for months this habit is forgotten, but awakens sometimes to self-assertion if a feeling of pressure is felt in the head, and a slight irritation elsewhere. An experience shows that the time has come for pacification. Exquisite pleasure can be enjoyed never more than twice a month, and sometimes less often. Observation. Romans 6. Unmarried, actively engaged in the practice of her profession, well-developed, feminine in contour, but boyish in manner and movements, strong though muscles small and healthy, with sound nervous system, never had anemia, thick brown hair, pubic hair thick and hair on toes and legs up to umbilicus. It began to appear at the age of 10 before pubic hair and continued until 18, a few stray hairs round nipples and much dark down on upper lip, as well as light down on arms and hands, hips normal, nates small, labia minora large, and clitoris deeply hooded, hymen thick, vagina probably small, considerable pigmentation of parts. Menstruation began at 15, but not regular till 17, is painless, and scanty. The better the state of health, the less it is no change of sexual or other feelings connected with it. It lasts 1 to 3 days. I believe, she writes, my first experience of physical sex sensations was when I was about 16 and in sleep, but I did not then recognize it, and seldom indeed gave the subject of sex a thought. I was a child far beyond the age of childhood. The accompanying dreams were disagreeable, but I cannot remember what they were about. It was not until I was nearly 19 that I knew the sexual orgasm in my waking state. It surprised me completely, but I knew that I had known it before in my sleep. The knowledge came one summer when I was leading a rather isolated life, and my mind was far from sex subjects, being deep in books Carlyle, Ruskin, Huxley, Darwin, Scott, etc. I noticed that when I got up in the morning, I felt very hot and uncomfortable. The clitoris and the parts around were swollen and erect, and often tender and painful. I had no idea what it was, but found I was unable to pass my water for an hour or two one day. When I was straining a little to pass water, the full orgasm occurred the next time it happened. I tried to check it by holding myself firmly, of course, with the opposite result. I do not know that I found it highly pleasurable, but it was a very great relief. I allowed myself a good many experiments to come to a conclusion in the matter, and I thought about it. I was much too shy to speak to anyone, and thought it was probably a sin. I tried not to do it, and not to think about it, saying to myself that surely I was lord of my body. But I found that the matter was not entirely under my control. However unwilling or passive I might be, there were times when the involuntary discomfort was not in my keeping. My touching myself or not did not save me from it, because it sometimes gave me pleasure. I thought it might be a form of self-indulgence, and did not do it until it could scarcely be helped. Soon the orgasm began to occur fairly frequently in my sleep, perhaps once or twice a week. I had no erotic dreams then or at any other time, but I had nights of restless sleep, and woke, as it occurred, dreaming that it was happening, as in fact it was. At times I hardly awoke, but went to sleep again in a moment. I continued for 2 or 3 years to be sorely tried by day at frequent intervals. I acquired a remarkable degree of control, so that though one touch or steadily directed thought would have caused the orgasm, I could keep it off and go to sleep. Without wrongdoing, of course. When I fell asleep, my control ended. All this gave me a good deal of physical worry, and kept my attention unwillingly fixed upon the matter. I do not think my body was readily irritable, but I had unquestionably very strong sexual impulses. After a year or two, when I was working hard, I could not afford the attention the control cost me, or the prolonged mitigated sexual excitement it caused. I took drugs for a time, but they lost effect, produced lassitude, and agreed with me badly. I therefore put away my scruples and determined to try the effect of giving myself an instant and businesslike relief. Instead of allowing my feelings to gather strength, I satisfied them out of hand. Instead of 5 hours of heat and discomfort, I did not allow myself 5 minutes if I could help it. The effect was marvelous. I practically had no more trouble. The thing rarely came to me at all by day, and though it continued at times by night, it became less frequent and less strong often. It did not wake me. The erotic images and speculations that had begun to come to me died down. I left off being afraid of my feelings, or indeed thinking about them. I may say that I had decided that I should be obliged to lead a single life, and that the less I thought about matters of sex, the more easy I should find life. Later on, I had religious ideas, which helped me considerably in my ideals of a decent, orderly, self-contained life. I do not lay stress on these. They were not at all emotional, and my physical and psychical development do not appear to have run much on parallel lines. I had a strong moral sense before I had a religious one, and a common sense, which I perhaps trusted more than either. When I was about 28, I thought I might perhaps leave off the habit of regular relief I had got into. It was not regular as regards time, being anything from 1 day to 6 weeks. The change was probably made easier by a severe illness I had had. I gave this abstinence a fair trial for several years, until I was about 34, but my nocturnal manifestations certainly gathered strength, especially when I got much better in health. And finally, as at puberty began to worry my waking life, I reasoned that by my attempt at abstinence, I had only exchanged control for uncontrol, and reverted to my old habits of relief, with the same good results as before. The whole trouble subsided, and I got better at once. The orgasm during sleep continued, and occurs about once a fortnight. It is increased by change of air, especially at the seaside, when it may occur on 2 or 3 nights running. I decided that for the proper control of my single life relief was normal and right. It would be very difficult for anyone to demonstrate the contrary to me. My aim has always been to keep myself in the best condition of physical and mental balance that a single person is capable of. There is some interest in briefly reviewing the remarkable transformations in the attitude toward masturbation from Greek times down to our own day. The Greeks treated masturbation with little opprobrium. At the worst, they regarded it as unmanly, and Aristophanes, in various passages, connects the practice with women, children, slaves, and feeble old men. Scynes seems to have publicly brought it as a charge against Demosthenes that he had practiced masturbation, though on the other hand Plutarch tells us that Diogenes, described by Zeller, the historian of Greek philosophy, as the most typical figure of ancient Greece, was praised by Chrysippus, the famous philosopher, for masturbating in the marketplace. The more strenuous Romans, at all events, as exemplified by Juvenal and Martial, condemned masturbation more vigorously. Aratus, without alluding to masturbation, dwells on the tonic effects of retaining the semen, but on the other hand, Galen regarded the retention of semen as injurious and advocated its frequent expulsion, a point of view which tended to justify masturbation in classical days. Doubtless masturbation and all other forms of the autoerotic impulse were comparatively rare, so much scope was allowed in early adult age for homosexual and later for heterosexual relationships that any excessive or morbid development of solitary self-indulgence could seldom occur. The case was altered when Christian ideals became prominent. Christian morality strongly proscribed sexual relationships, except under certain specified conditions. It is true that Christianity discouraged all sexual manifestations, and that therefore its ban fell equally on masturbation, but obviously masturbation lay at the weakest line of defense against the assaults of the flesh. It was there that resistance would most readily yield. Christianity thus probably led to a considerable increase of masturbation. The attention which the theologians devoted to its manifestations clearly bears witness to their magnitude. It is noteworthy that Mohammedan theologians regarded masturbation as a Christian vice. In Islam, both doctrine and practice tended to encourage sexual relationships, and not much attention was paid to masturbation, nor even any severe reprobation directed against it. Omer Haleby remarks that certain theologians of Islam are inclined to consider the practice of masturbation in vogue among Christians as allowable to devout Mussulmans. When alone on a journey, he himself regards this as a practice good neither for soul nor body. Seminal emissions during sleep, providing all necessary relief. Should, however, a Mussulman fall into this error, God is merciful. In Theodore's penitential of the 7th century, 40 days penance is prescribed for masturbation. Aquinas condemned masturbation as worse than fornication, though less heinous than other sexual offenses against nature. In opposition also to those who believed that distillatio usually takes place without pleasure, he observed that it was often caused by sexual emotion, and should therefore always be mentioned. To the confessor Liguori also regarded masturbation as a graver sin than fornication, and even said that distillatio, if voluntary and with notable physical commotion, is without doubt a mortal sin, for in such a case it is the beginning of a pollution. On the other hand, some theologians have thought that distillatio may be permitted, even if there is some commotion, so long as it has not been voluntarily procured. And Caramule, who has been described as a theological enfant terrible, declared that natural law does not forbid masturbation, but that proposition was condemned by Innocent Roman. 11. The most enlightened modern Catholic view is probably represented by Debrin, who, after remarking that he has known pious and intelligent persons who had an irresistible impulse to masturbate, continues, "Must we excuse or condemn these people? Neither the one nor the other. If you condemn and repulse absolutely these persons as altogether guilty against their own convictions, you will perhaps throw them into despair. If, on the contrary, you completely excuse them, you maintain them in a disorder from which they may perhaps never emerge. Adopt a wise middle course, and perhaps with God's aid you may often cure them." Under certain circumstances, some Catholic theologians have permitted a married woman to masturbate. Thus, the Jesuit theologian Gurry asserts that the wife does not sin, si ipsum tactibus excitat, ad seminationem statim post copulam, in qua vers solus seminavit. This teaching seems to have been misunderstood, since ethical and even medical writers have expended a certain amount of moral indignation on the Church, whose theologians committed themselves to this statement. As a matter of fact, this qualified permission to masturbate merely rests on a false theory of procreation, which is clearly expressed in the word seminatio. It was believed that ejaculation in the woman is as necessary to fecundation as ejaculation in the man. Galen Avicenna and Aquinas recognized indeed that such feminine semination was not necessary. Sanchez, however, was doubtful, while Suarez and Zacchia, following Hippocrates, regarded it as necessary, as sexual intercourse without fecundation is not approved by the Catholic Church. It thus became logically necessary to permit women to masturbate whenever the ejaculation of mucus had not occurred at or before coitus. The belief that the emission of vaginal mucus under the influence of sexual excitement in women corresponded to spermatic emission has led to the practice of masturbation on hygienic grounds. Garnier Celibat, p. 255 mentions that Messu in the 18th century invented a special pessary to take the place of the penis, and as he stated, effect the due expulsion of the feminine sperm. Protestantism, no doubt in the main, accepted the general Catholic tradition, but the tendency of Protestantism in reaction against the minute inquisition of the earlier theologians has always been to exercise a certain degree of what it regarded as wholesome indifference toward the less obvious manifestations of the flesh. Thus, in Protestant countries, masturbation seems to have been almost ignored until Tissot, combining with his reputation as a physician the fanaticism of a devout believer, raised masturbation to the position of a colossal bogey, which during 100 years has not only had an unfortunate influence on medical opinion in these matters, but has been productive of incalculable harm to ignorant youth and tender consciences during the past 40 years. The efforts of many distinguished physicians, few of whose opinions I have already quoted, have gradually dragged the bogey down from its pedestal, and now, as I have ventured to suggest, there is a tendency for the reaction to be excessive. There is even a tendency today to regard masturbation with various qualifications as normal. Remy de Gourmont, for instance, considers that masturbation is natural because it is the method by which fishes procreate. All things considered, it must be accepted that masturbation is part of the doings of nature. A different conclusion might be agreeable, but in every ocean and under the reeds of every river myriads of beings would protest. Tillier remarks that since masturbation appears to be universal among the higher animals, we are not entitled to regard it as a vice. It has only been so considered because studied exclusively by physicians under abnormal conditions. Hirth, while asserting that masturbation must be strongly repressed in the young, regards it as a desirable method of relief for adults, and especially under some circumstances for women. Venturi, well-known Italian alienist, on the other hand, regards masturbation as strictly physiological in youth. It is the normal and natural passage toward the generous and healthy passion of early manhood. It only becomes abnormal and vicious, he holds, when continued into adult life. The appearance of masturbation at puberty, Venturi considers, is a moment in the course of the development of the function of that organ, which is the necessary instrument of sexuality. It finds its motive in the satisfaction of an organic need, having much analogy with that which arises from the tickling of a very sensitive cutaneous surface. In this masturbation of early adolescence lies, according to Venturi, the germ of what will later be love, a pleasure of the body and of the spirit following the relief of a satisfied need. As the youth develops, onanism becomes a sexual act comparable to coitus, as a dream is comparable to reality, imagery forming in correspondence with the desires in its fully developed form. In adolescence, Venturi continues, masturbation has an almost hallucinatory character. Onanism, at this period, psychically approximates to the true sexual act, and passes insensibly into it. If, however, continued on into adult age, it becomes morbid, passing into erotic fetishism. What in the inexperienced youth is the natural auxiliary and stimulus to imagination in the degenerate onanist of adult age is a sign of arrested development. Thus onanism, the author concludes, is not always a vice, such as is fiercely combated by educators and moralists. It is the natural transition by which we reach the warm and generous love of youth, and in natural succession to this, the tranquil positive matrimonial love of the mature man. Silvio Venturi, La Degenerazione Psychosexuale, 1892, pp. 69. It may be questioned whether this view is acceptable even for the warm climate of the south of Europe, where the impulses of sexuality are undoubtedly precocious. It is certainly not in harmony with general experience and opinion in the north. This is well expressed in the following passage by Edward Carpenter, International Journal of Ethics, July 1899. After all, purity in the sense of continence is of the first importance to boyhood to prolong the period of continence in a boy's life. To prolong the period of growth, this is a simple physiological law and a very obvious one. And whatever other things may be said in favor of purity, it remains perhaps the most weighty to introduce sensual and sexual habits, and one of the worst of them is self-abuse at an early age, is to arrest growth both physical and mental. And what is even more, it means to arrest the capacity for affection. All experience shows that the early outlet towards sex cheapens and weakens affectional capacity. I do not consider that we can decide the precise degree in which masturbation may fairly be called normal so long as we take masturbation by itself. We are thus, in conclusion, brought back to the point which I sought to emphasize at the outset. Masturbation belongs to a group of autoerotic phenomena. From one point of view, it may be said that all autoerotic phenomena are unnatural, since the natural aim of the sexual impulse is sexual conjunction, and all exercise of that impulse outside such conjunction is away from the end of nature. But we do not live in a state of nature which answers to such demands. All our life is unnatural, and as soon as we begin to restrain the free play of sexual impulse towards sexual ends, at once autoerotic phenomena inevitably spring up on every side. There is no end to them. It is impossible to say what finest elements in art, in morals, in civilization generally may not really be rooted in an autoerotic impulse. Without a certain overheating of the sexual system, said Nietzsche, we could not have a Raphael. Autoerotic phenomena are inevitable. It is our wisest course to recognize this inevitableness of sexual and transmuted sexual manifestations under the perpetual restraints of civilized life, and while avoiding any attitude of excessive indulgence or indifference, to avoid also any attitude of excessive horror, for our horror not only leads to the facts being effectually veiled from our sight, but itself serves to manufacture artificially a greater evil than that which we seek to combat. The sexual impulse is not, as some have imagined, the sole root of the most massive human emotions, the most brilliant human aptitudes of sympathy, of art, of religion, in the complex human organism, where all the parts are so manifibrid and so closely interwoven. No great manifestation can be reduced to one single source, but it largely enters into and molds all of these emotions and aptitudes, and that by virtue of its two most peculiar characteristics, it is in the first place the deepest and most volcanic of human impulses, and in the second place, unlike the only other human impulse with which it can be compared, the nutritive impulse, it can to a large extent be transmuted into a new force, capable of the strangest and most various uses, so that in the presence of all these manifestations, we may assert that in a real sense, though subtly mingled with very diverse elements, autoerotism everywhere plays its part in the phenomena of autoerotism. When we take a broad view of those phenomena, we are concerned not with a form of insanity, not necessarily with a form of depravity, but with the inevitable byproducts of that mighty process on which the animal creation rests. For a bibliography of masturbation, see Roulder Die Masturbation, pp. 11-18, also Arthur Mack, Donald Le Criminal Type, pp. 227, et sex cf. G. Stanley Hall, Adolescence Vol. I. pp. 432, et seq. Oscar Berger Archive für Psychiatrie, BD 6, 1876. Die Masturbation, p. 41. Duke's Preservation of Health 1880, 4p. 150. G. Stanley Hall, Adolescence, Vol. IP 434. F. S. Brockman, A Study of the Moral and Religious Life of Students, in the United States Pedagogical Seminary, September 1902. Many pitiful narratives are reproduced. Moraglia die Anani beim normalen Weib und bei den Prostituten Zeitschrift für Kriminalanthropologie, 1897 p. 489. It should be added that Moraglia is not a very critical investigator. It is probable, however, that on this point his results are an approximation to the truth. Ernst Anthropological Researches on the Population of Venezuela, Memoirs of the Anthropological Society, Vol. Roman 3, 1870 p. 277. Misforo, il Gergo ni normali, etc. 1897, Cap Roman 52, 98. Debrin Mikhailogi p. 64. Yet theologians and casuists, Debrin remarks frequently never refer to masturbation in women. Stanley Hall op. Cit. Vol. IP 34. Hall mentions also that masturbation is specially common among the blind. Moraglia Archivio di Psichiatria, Vol. Roman 16 Fasc 4 and 5 p. 313. See his careful study Die sexuellen Perversitäten in der Irrenanstalt Psychiatrisch, Bladen, No. 2, 1899. Venturi Degenerazioni Psychosexuali, pp. 105, 133, 148, 152. J. P. West Transactions of the Ohio Pediatric Society, 1895, Abstract in Medical, Standard November 1895. Cases are also recorded by J. T. Winter. Self-Abuse in Infancy and Childhood, American Journal Obstetrics, June 1902. Freud Abhandlungen zur Sexualtheorie, pp. 36 et seq. G. E. Shuttleworth, British Medical Journal, October 3, 1903. See for a detailed study of sexuality in childhood. Mall's valuable book, Das Sexualleben des Kindes, cf. Vol. Roman 6, of these studies, ch. Roman 2307. This is no doubt the most common opinion, and it is frequently repeated in textbooks. It is scarcely necessary, however, to point out that only the opinions of those who have given special attention to the matter can carry any weight. R. W. Schufelt, on a case of female impotency, pp. 57, quotes the opinions of various cautious observers as to the difficulty of detecting masturbation in women. This latter opinion is confirmed by Nacke so far as the insane are concerned. In a careful study of sexual perversity in a large asylum, Nacke found that while moderate masturbation could be more easily traced among men than among women, excessive masturbation was more common among women, and while among the men masturbation was most frequent in the lowest grades of mental development, idiocy and imbecility, and least frequent in the highest grades, general paralysis, in the women it was the reverse. P. Nacke die sexuellen Perversitäten in der Irrenanstalt Psychiatrisch en Neurologisch, Bladen, No. 2, 1899. Mammary masturbation sometimes occurs. See, for example, Rolder die Masturbation, pp. 32-33. It is, however, rare. Hirschsprung pointed out this, indeed, many years ago on the ground of his own experience, and see Rolder op. Cit. pp. 44-47. In many cases, of course, the physical precocity is associated with precocity in sexual habits. An instructive case is reported alienist and neurologist October 1895 of a girl of 7, a beautiful child of healthy family and very intelligent, who from the age of 3 was perpetually masturbating when not watched the clitoris and mons. Veneris were those of a fully grown woman, and the child was as well informed upon most subjects as an average woman. She was cured by care and hygienic attention, and when seen last was in excellent condition. A medical friend tells me of a little girl of 2 whose external genital organs are greatly developed and who is always rubbing herself. R. T. Morris of New York has also pointed out the influence of traditions in this respect among boys. He remarks, there are traditions to the effect that self-abuse is harmful among girls. However, there are no such saving traditions Dr. Kiernan writes in a private letter, "It has been by experience that from ignorance or otherwise, there are young women who do not look upon sexual manipulation with the same fear that men do gutseat." Similarly remarks that men have been warned of masturbation and fear its evil results, while girls, even if warned, attach little importance to the warning. He adds that in healthy women, masturbation, even in excess, has little bad results. The attitude of many women in this matter may be illustrated by the following passage from a letter written by a medical friend in India. "The other day, one of my English women patients gave me the following reason for having taught the 17-year-old daughter of a retired colonel to masturbate. Poor girl, she was troubled with dreams of men, and in case she should be tempted with one and become pregnant, I taught her to bring the feeling on herself, as it is safer, and after all nearly as nice as with a man." H. Ellis Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 2, Sexual Inversion, Chapter 4314. See also the appendix to the third volume of these studies, in which I have brought forward sexual histories of normal persons. E. H. Smith also states that from 25 to 35 is the age when most women come under the physician's eye with manifest and pronounced habits of masturbation. It may, however, be instructive to observe that at the end of the volume we find an advertisement of Dr. Robinson's treatise on the virtues and efficacy of a crust of bread, eat early in the morning fasting. Pouillet alone enumerates and apparently accepts considerably over 100 different morbid conditions as signs and results of masturbation. Ogenkrankheiten bij masturbant nap Schwagers, Archive für Ogenheitkunde, BD Roman 2, 1882, p. 198. Salmo Cone Uterus und, Og 1890, pp. 63-66. Functions du Cerveau 1825, Vol Roman 3, p. 337. W. Ellis Treatise on Insanity 1838, pp. 330, 340. Clara Barris Insanity in Young Women, Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, June 1896. See for instance, H. Emminghaus Die Psychosen des Kindesalters Gerlens Handbuch, der Kinder Krankheiten Nachtrag, Roman 2, pp. 61-63. Christian Article Anonymisme Dictionnaire Encyclopedique des Sciences Medicales. Naki Verbrechen und Wansen beim Weib, 1894, p. 57. J. Roman 50 A. Koch Die Psychopathischen Minderwertigkeiten, 1892, p. 273, et seq. J. G. Kiernan, American Journal of Insanity, July 1877. Maudsley dealt, in his vigorous, picturesque manner, with the more extreme morbid mental conditions sometimes found associated with masturbation in illustrations of a variety of Insanity Journal of Mental Science, July 1868. See for example Lowenfeld Sexualeben und Nervenleiden 2d. ed. ch. Roman 8330. Maro la Puberta, Turin 1890, 8p. 174. E. Roman 100 Spitzka Cases of Masturbation, Journal of Mental Science, July 1888. Charles West Lancet, November 17, 1866. Gower's Epilepsy, 1881, p. 31. Lowenfeld believes that epileptic attacks are certainly caused by masturbation. Fear thought that both epilepsy and hysteria may be caused by masturbation. Ziemson's Handbuch, BD Roman 11335. Adolescence Vol. IP 441. See a discussion of these points by Rolder Die Masturbation, pp. 168,175. The surgeons, it may be remarked, have especially stated the harmlessness of masturbation in too absolute a manner, thus John Hunter Treatise on the Venereal Disease, 1786, p. 200, after pointing out that the books on this subject have done more harm than good, adds, I think I may affirm that this act does less harm to the Constitution in general than the natural, and Sir James Paget, in his lecture on sexual hypochondriasis, said masturbation does neither more nor less harm than sexual intercourse practiced with the same frequency, in the same conditions of general health and age and circumstances. It is interesting to note that an analogous result seems to hold with animals among hybrid horses. Excessive masturbation is liable to occur with injurious results. It is scarcely necessary to point out that hybrid horses are apt to be abnormal. With regard to the physical signs, the same conclusion is reached by Legludic in opposition to Martineau on the basis of a large experience. He has repeatedly found in young girls who acknowledged frequent masturbation that the organs were perfectly healthy and normal, and his convictions are the more noteworthy since he speaks as a pupil of Tardieu, who attached very grave significance to the local signs of sexual perversity and excess. Legludic notes, et observations de médecine légale, 1896 p. 95, Matthews Duncan Galstonian Lectures on Sterility in Women, 1884 p. 97, was often struck by the smallness and even imperfect development of the external genitals of women who masturbate. Clara Barris considers that there is no necessary connection between hypertrophy of the external female genital organs and masturbation, though in 6 cases of prolonged masturbation, she found such a condition in 3 American Journal of Insanity, April 1895 p. 479. Bocteroux denies that masturbation produces enlargement of the penis, and Hammond considers there is no evidence to show that it enlarges the clitoris, while Gutzeit states that it does not enlarge the nymph. This, however, is doubtful. It would not suffice, in many cases, to show that large sexual organs are correlated with masturbation. It would still be necessary to show whether the size of the organs stood to masturbation in the relation of effect or of cause. Thus, Bechterou La Phobie du Regard Archives de Neurologie, July 1905, considers that masturbation plays a large part in producing the morbid fear of the eyes of others. It is especially an undesirable tendency of masturbation that it deadens the need for affection and merely eludes, instead of satisfying the sexual impulse. Masturbation, as Godfrey Well says, The Science of Sex, p. 178, though a manifestation of sexual activity, is not a sexual act in the higher or even in the real fundamental sense, for sex implies duality, a characteristic to which masturbation can plainly lay no claim. The physical, moral, and mental reciprocity which gives stability and beauty to a normal sexual intimacy are as foreign to the masturbator as to the celibate. In a sense, therefore, masturbation is as complete a negative of the sexual life as chastity itself. It is therefore an evasion of, not an answer to the sexual problem, and it will ever remain so, no matter how surely we may be convinced of its physical harmlessness. I learnt that dangerous supplement Rousseau tells us, Part 1 BK Roman 3, which deceives nature. This vice, which bashfulness and timidity find so convenient, has moreover a great attraction for lively imaginations, for it enables them to do what they will, so to speak, with the whole fair sex, and to enjoy at pleasure the beauty who attracts them without having obtained her consent. Ik had zij werkelijk verloren, die tolheid mit der ik meenen fehler, en meer selbst racht indem ik auf mancherlei unsinnig, wise in mijn physisch nater, sturmt der sittlichen etwas, zu leid zu thun hat sehr veel, zu den korperlichen, jubeln begetrigen, unter denen ik einig, der bestenjar mains, lebens verler jarik wer vielleicht. En diesem verlust valig, zu grund jegengen hat sich hierer nicht, des poetisch talent, mit seinen Haukriften besonders Hulfreich Erwison. This is scarcely conclusive, and it may be added that there were many reasons why Goethe should have suffered physically at this time, quite apart from masturbation. See, for example, Bielskowski Life of Goethe Vol. IP 88. Les Obsessions, Vol. Roman 2 p. 136. A somewhat similar classification has already been made by Max Dissoir, who points out that we must distinguish between onanists aus Nath and onanists aus Leidenschaft, the latter group alone being of really serious importance. The classification of Dallamagni is also somewhat similar. He distinguishes onany par impulsion occurring in mental degeneration, and in persons of inferior intelligence, from onany par evocation, o obsession. W. Xavier Sudduth, A Study in the Psychophysics of Masturbation, Chicago Medical Recorder, March 1898, Hague, who reaches a similar conclusion, has sought to find its precise mechanism in the blood pressure, As the sexual act produces lower and falling blood pressure, he remarks it will of necessity relieve conditions which are due to high and rising blood pressure, such for instance as mental depression and bad temper. And unless my observation deceives me, we have here a connection between conditions of high blood pressure with mental and bodily depression, and acts of masturbation for this act will relieve these conditions and tend to be practiced for this purpose. Uric acid, 6th edition, p. 154. Northcote discusses the classic attitude towards masturbation, Christianity, and sex problems, p. 233. El Kitab, Traduction de Paul de Regla, Paris, 1893. Remai de Guermont, Physique de l'amour, p. 133. Tillier, El Instinct Sexuel, Paris, 1889, p. 270. G. Herthweij, Zur Heimat, p. 648. Fear, in the course of his valuable work, El Instinct Sexuel, stated that my conclusion is that masturbation is normal, and that l'indulgence s'impose. I had, however, already guarded myself against this misinterpretation. Appendix O. The influence of menstruation on the position of women. A question of historical psychology, which so far as I know has never been fully investigated, is the influence of menstruation in constituting the emotional atmosphere through which men habitually view women. I do not purpose to deal fully with this question, because it is one which may be more properly dealt with at length by the student of culture and by the historian rather than from the standpoint of empirical psychology. It is moreover a question full of complexities in regard to which it is impossible to speak with certainty, but we here strike on a factor of such importance, such neglected importance, for the proper understanding of the sexual relations of men and women, that it cannot be wholly ignored. Among the Negroes of Suriname, a woman must live in solitude during the time of her period. It is dangerous for any man or woman to approach her, and when she sees a person coming near, she cries out anxiously, me, I am unclean, I am unclean throughout the world. We find traces of the custom of which this is a typical example, but we must not too hastily assume that this custom is evidence of the inferior position occupied by semi-civilized women. It is necessary to take a broad view not only of the beliefs of semi-civilized man regarding menstruation, but of his general beliefs regarding the supernatural forces of the world. There is no fragment of folklore so familiar to the European world as that which connects woman with the serpent. It is indeed one of the foundation stones of Christian theology, yet there is no fragment of folklore which remains more obscure. How has it happened that in all parts of the world the snake, or his congeners, the lizard and the crocodile, have been credited with some design sinister or erotic on women? Of the wide prevalence of the belief, there can be no doubt. Among the Port Lincoln tribe of South Australia, a lizard is said to have divided man from woman. Among the Cariguanos of Bolivia, on the appearance of menstruation, old women ran about with sticks to hunt the snake that had wounded the girl. Fraser, who quotes this example from the letters Edifiants et Curiouses, also refers to a modern Greek folktale according to which a princess at puberty must not let the sun shine upon her, or she would be turned into a lizard. The lizard was a sexual symbol among the Mexicans. In some parts of Brazil, at the onset of puberty, a girl must not go into the woods for fear of the amorous attacks of snakes. And so it is also among the Macusi Indians of British Guiana. According to Schomburg, among the Basutos of South Africa, the young girls must dance around the clay image of a snake. In Polynesian mythology, the lizard is a very sacred animal, and legends represent women as often giving birth to lizards at a widely remote spot in Bengal. If you dream of a snake, a child will be born to you, reports Sarat Chandra Mitra in the Berlin Museum für Völkerkunde. There is a carved wooden figure from New Guinea of a woman into whose vulva a crocodile is inserting its snout, while the same museum contains another figure of a snake-like crocodile crawling out of a woman's vulva, and a third figure shows a small round snake with a small head and closely resembling a penis at the mouth of the vagina. All these figures are reproduced by Ploss and Bartels even in modern Europe. The same ideas prevail in Portugal. According to Reis, it is believed that during menstruation women are liable to be bitten by lizards, and to guard against this risk, they wear drawers during the period. In Germany again, it was believed up to the 18th century at least that the hair of a menstruating woman, if buried, would turn into a snake. It may be added that in various parts of the world virgin priestesses are dedicated to a snake god and are married to the god. At Rome, it is interesting to note the serpent was the symbol of fecundation, and as such often figures at Pompeii as the genius patris familias, the generative power of the family in rabbinical tradition. Also, the serpent is the symbol of sexual desire. There can be no doubt Thotas, Ploss, and Bartels, from whom some of these examples have been taken, point out in widely different parts of the world menstruation is believed to have been originally caused by a snake, and that this conception is frequently associated with an erotic and mystic idea. How the connection arose, Ploss and Bartels are unable to say. It can only be suggested that its shape and appearance, as well as its venomous nature, may have contributed to the mystery everywhere associated with the Snakia mystery itself, fortified by the association with Wominto, build up this worldwide belief regarding the origin of menstruation. This primitive theory of the origin of menstruation probably brings before us in its earliest shape the special and intimate bond which has ever been held to connect women by virtue of the menstrual process with the natural or supernatural powers of the world. Everywhere menstruating women are supposed to be possessed by spirits and charged with mysterious forces. It is at this point that a serious misconception due to ignorance of primitive religious ideas has constantly intruded. It is stated that the menstruating woman is unclean and possessed by an evil spirit. As a matter of fact, however, the savage rarely discriminates between bad and good spirits. Every spirit may have either a beneficial or malignant influence. An interesting instance of this is given in Colenso's Maori lexicon, as illustrated by the meaning of the Maori word atua. The importance of recognizing the special sense in which the word unclean is used in this connection was clearly pointed out by Robertson Smith. In the case of the Semites, the Hebrew word tame, unclean, he remarked, is not the ordinary word for things physically foul. It is a ritual term, and corresponds exactly to the idea of taboo. The ideas unclean and holy seem to us to stand in polar opposition to one another, but it was not so. With the Semites among the later Jews, the holy books defiled the hands of the reader, as contact with an impure thing did among Lucian's Syrians. The dove was so holy that he who touched it was unclean for a day, and the taboo attaching to the swine was explained by some, and beyond question, correctly explained, in the same way among the heathen Semites. Therefore, unclean animals, which it was pollution to eat, were simply holy animals. Robertson Smith here made no reference to menstruation, but he exactly described the primitive attitude toward menstruation. Wellhausen, however, dealing with the early Arabians, expressly mentions that in pre-Islamic days clean and unclean were used solely with reference to women in and out of the menstrual state. At a later date, Fraser developed this aspect of the conception of taboo and showed how it occurs among savage races. Generally, he pointed out that the conceptions of holiness and pollution, not having yet been differentiated, women at childbirth and during menstruation are on the same level as divine kings, chiefs, and priests, and must observe the same rules of ceremonial purity to seclude such persons from the rest of the world, so that the dreaded spiritual danger shall not spread, is the object of the taboo, which Fraser compares to an electrical insulator. To preserve the spiritual force with which these persons are charged from suffering or inflicting harm by contact with the outer world, after describing the phenomena, especially the prohibition to touch the ground or see the sun found among various races, Fraser concludes the object of secluding women at menstruation is to neutralize the dangerous influences which are supposed to emanate from them at such times. The general effect of these rules is to keep the girl suspended, so to say, between heaven and earth, whether enveloped in a hammock and slung up to the roof as in South America, or elevated above the ground in a dark and narrow cage as in New Zealand. She may be considered to be out of the way of doing mischief, since being shut off both from the earth and from the sun, she can poison neither of these great sources of life by her deadly contagion. The precautions thus taken to isolate or insulate the girl are dictated by regard for her own safety, as well as for the safety of others. In short, the girl is viewed as charged with a powerful force, which if not kept within bounds, may prove the destruction both of the girl herself and of all with whom she comes in contact. To repress this force within the limits necessary for the safety of all concerned is the object of the taboos in question. The same explanation applies to the observance of the same rules by divine kings and priests. The uncleanliness, as it is called, of girls at puberty, and the sanctity of holy men do not to the primitive mind differ from each other. They are only different manifestations of the same supernatural energy, which, like energy in general, is in itself neither good nor bad, but becomes beneficent or malignant according to its application. More recently, this view of the matter has been further extended by the distinguished French sociologist Durkheim, investigating the origins of the prohibition of incest and arguing that it proceeds from the custom of exogamy or marriage outside the clan, and that this rests on certain ideas about blood, which again are traceable to totemism, a theory which we need not here discuss. Durkheim is brought face to face with the group of conceptions that now concern us. He insists on the extreme ambiguity found in primitive culture concerning the notion of the divine and the close connection between aversion and veneration, and points out that it is not only at puberty and each recurrence of the menstrual epoch that women have aroused these emotions, but also at childbirth, a sentiment of religious horror, he continues, which can reach such degree of intensity, which can be called forth by so many circumstances, and reappears regularly every month to last for a week at least, cannot fail to extend its influence beyond the periods to which it was originally confined, and to affect the whole course of life. A being who must be secluded or avoided for weeks, months, or years preserves something of the characteristics to which the isolation was due even outside those special periods, and in fact in these communities the separation of the sexes is not merely intermittent, it has become chronic. The two elements of the population live separately. Durkheim proceeds to argue that the origin of the occult powers attributed to the feminine organism is to be found in primitive ideas concerning blood. Not only menstrual blood, but any kind of blood is the object of such feelings among savage and barbarous peoples. All sorts of precautions must be observed with regard to blood. In it resides a divine principle, or as Romans, Jews, and Arabs believed, life itself. The prohibition to drink wine, the blood of the grape, found among some peoples, is traced to its resemblance to blood, and to its sacrificial employment, as among the ancient Arabians, and still in the Christian sacrament, as a substitute for drinking blood. Throughout, blood is generally taboo, and it taboos everything that comes in contact with it. Now woman is chronically the theater of bloody manifestations, and therefore she tends to become chronically taboo for the other members of the community. A more or less conscious anxiety, a certain religious fear, cannot fail to enter into all the relations of her companions with her, and that is why all such relations are reduced to a minimum. Relations of a sexual character are specially excluded in the first place. Such relations are so intimate that they are incompatible with the sort of repulsion which the sexes must experience for each other. The barrier between them does not permit of such a close union. In the second place, the organs of the body here specially concerned are precisely the source of the dreaded manifestations. Thus it is natural that the feelings of aversion inspired by women attain their greatest intensity at this point. Thus, it is also that of all parts of the feminine organization, it is this region which is most severely shut out from commerce, so that while the primitive emotion is mainly one of veneration, and is allied to that experienced for kings and priests, there is an element of fear in such veneration, and what men fear is to some extent odious to them. These conceptions necessarily mingled at a very early period with men's ideas of sexual intercourse with women, and especially with menstruating women. Contact with women, as Crawley shows by abundant illustration, is dangerous in any case. Indeed, the same ideas being transferred to women, also coitus produces weakness, and it prevents the acquisition of supernatural powers. Thus among the Western tribes of Canada, Boaz states only a youth who has never touched a woman or a virgin, both being called Te-its, can become shamans after having had sexual intercourse. Men as well as women become Te-ki, el Roman 1 weak, incapable of gaining supernatural powers. The faculty cannot be regained by subsequent fasting and abstinence. The mysterious effects of sexual intercourse in general are intensified in the case of intercourse with a menstruating woman. Thus the ancient Indian legislator declares that the wisdom, the energy, the strength, the sight, and the vitality of a man who approaches a woman covered with menstrual excretions utterly perish. It will be seen that these ideas are impartially spread over the most widely separated parts of the globe. They equally affected the Christian Church, and the penitentials ordained 40 or 50 days penance for sexual intercourse during menstruation. Yet the twofold influence of the menstruating woman remains clear when we review the whole group of influences, which in this state she is supposed to exert. She by no means acts only by paralyzing social activities and destroying the powers of life, by causing flowers to fade, fruit to fall from the tree's grains, to lose their germinative power, and grafts to die. She is not accurately summed up in the old lines. O menstruating woman, thou'rt a fiend, from whom all nature should be closely screened. Her powers are also beneficial. A woman at this time, as Lyon expressed it, is in regular communication with the starry bodies. Even at other times, a woman, when led naked around the orchard, protected it from caterpillars, said Pliny, and this belief is acted upon according to Bastanzi. Even in the Italy of today, a garment stained with a virgin's menstrual blood, it is said in Bavaria, is a certain safeguard against cuts and stabs. It will also extinguish fire. It was valuable as a love philter, as a medicine. Its uses have been endless. A sect of Valentinians even attributed sacramental virtues to menstrual blood, and partook of it as the blood of Christ. The Church soon, however, acquired a horror of menstruating women. They were frequently not allowed to take the sacrament or to enter sacred places, and it was sometimes thought best to prohibit the presence of women altogether. The Anglo-Saxon penitentials declared that menstruating women must not enter a church. It appears to have been Gregory Roman II who overturned this doctrine. In our own time, the slow disintegration of primitive animistic conceptions, aided certainly by the degraded conception of sexual phenomena taught by medieval monks, for whom woman was templum difficatum super cloacam, has led to a disbelief in the more salutary influences of the menstruating woman. A fairly widespread faith in her pernicious influence alone survives. It may be traced even in practical and commercial own. Might add medical quarters in the great sugar refineries in the north of France. The regulations strictly forbid a woman to enter the factory while the sugar is boiling or cooling, the reason given being that if a woman were to enter during her period, the sugar would blacken. For the same reason, to turn to the east, no woman is employed in the opium manufactory at Saigon, it being said that the opium would turn and become bitter, while Annamite women say that it is very difficult for them to prepare opium pipes during the catamenial period. In India again, when a native in charge of a lime kiln, which had gone wrong, declared that one of the women workers must be menstruating, all the women Hindus, Mahometans, Aboriginal Gans, showed by their energetic denials that they understood this superstition. In 1878, a member of the British Medical Association wrote to the British Medical Journal asking whether it was true that if a woman cured hams while menstruating, the hams would be spoiled. He had known this to happen twice. Another medical man wrote that if so, what would happen to the patients of menstruating lady doctors. A third wrote in the Journal for April 27, 1878, I thought the fact was so generally known to every housewife and cook that meat would spoil if salted at the menstrual period, that I am surprised to see so many letters on the subject in the Journal. If I am not mistaken, the question was mooted many years ago in the periodicals. It is undoubtedly the fact that meat will be tainted if cured by women at the catamenial period. Whatever the rationale may be, I can speak positively as to the fact. It is probably the influence of these primitive ideas which has caused surgeons and gynecologists to dread operations during the catamenial period. Such, at all events, is the opinion of a distinguished authority, Dr. William Goodell, who wrote in 1,891,372, I have learned to unlearn the teaching that women must not be subjected to a surgical operation during the monthly flux. Our forefathers from time immemorial have thought and taught that the presence of a menstruating woman would pollute solemn religious rites, would sour milk, spoil the fermentation in wine vats, and much other mischief. in a general way influenced by hoary tradition, modern physicians very generally postpone all operative treatment until the flow has ceased, but why this delay if time is precious, and it enters as an important factor in the case? I have found menstruation to be the very best time to curette away fungus vegetations of the endometrium, for being swollen then by the afflux of blood, they are larger than at any other time, and can the more readily be removed. There is indeed no surer way of checking or of stopping a metrorrhagia than by curetting the womb during the very flow, while I do not select this period for the removal of ovarian cysts or for other abdominal work, such as the extirpation of the ovaries or a kidney or breaking up intestinal adhesions, etc. Yet I have not hesitated to perform these operations at such a time, and have never had reason to regret the course. The only operations that I should dislike to perform during menstruation would be those involving the womb itself. It must be added to this that we still have to take into consideration not merely the surviving influence of ancient primitive beliefs, but the possible existence of actual nervous conditions during the menstrual period producing what may be described as an abnormal nervous tension. In this way, we are doubtless concerned with a tissue of phenomena inextricably woven of folklore, autosuggestion, false observation, and real mental and nervous abnormality. Laurent Locke has brought forward several cases which may illustrate this point. Thus he speaks of two young girls of about 16 and 17, slightly neuropathic, but without definite hysterical symptoms, who during the menstrual period feel themselves in a sort of electrical state, with tingling and prickling sensations and feelings of attraction or repulsion at the contact of various objects. These girls believe their garments stick to their skin during the periods. It was only with difficulty that they could remove their slippers, though fitting easily stockings had to be drawn off violently by another person, and they had given up changing their chemises during the period because the linen became so glued to the skin. An orchestral performer on the double bass informed Laurent that whenever he left a tuned double bass in his lodgings during his wife's period, a string snapped. Consequently, he always removed his instrument at this time to a friend's house. He added that the same thing happened 2 years earlier with a mistress, a cave concert singer, who had indeed warned him beforehand. A harpist also informed Laurent that she had been obliged to give up her profession, because during her periods several strings of her harp, always the same strings, broke, especially when she was playing. A friend of Laurent's, an official in Cochin China, also told him that the strings of his violin often snapped during the menstrual periods of his Annamite mistress, who informed him that Annamite women are familiar with the phenomenon and are careful not to play on their instruments at this time. Two young ladies, both good violinists, also affirmed that ever since their first menstruation they had noted a tendency for the strings to snap at this period. One genuine artist, who often performed at charity concerts, systematically refused to play at these times and was often embarrassed to find a pretext. The other, who admitted that she was nervous and irritable at such times, had given up playing on account of the trouble of changing the strings so frequently. Laurent also refers to the frequency with which women break things during the menstrual periods and considers that this is not simply due to the awkwardness caused by nervous exhaustion or hysterical tremors, but that there is spontaneous breakage. Most usually it happens that a glass breaks when it is being dried with a cloth. Needles also break with unusual facility at this time. Clocks are stopped by merely placing the hand upon them. I do not here attempt to estimate critically the validity of these alleged manifestations, some of which may certainly be explained by the unconscious muscular action, which forms the basis of the phenomena of table-turning and thought-reading. Such a task may best be undertaken through the minute study of isolated cases, and in this place I am merely concerned with the general influence of the menstrual state in affecting the social position of women, without reference to the analysis of the elements that go to make up that influence. There is only one further point to which attention may be called. I allude to the way in which the more favorable side of the primitive conception of the menstruating woman as priestess, sibyl, prophetess, an almost miraculous agent for good, an angel, the peculiar home of the divine element, was slowly and continuously carried on side by side with with the less favorable view through the beginnings of European civilization, until our own times the actual physical phenomena of menstruation, with the ideas of taboo associated with that state, sank into the background as culture evolved. But on the other hand, the ideas of the angelic position and spiritual mission of women, based on the primitive conception of the mystery associated with menstruation, still in some degree persisted. It is evident, however, that while in one form or another the more favorable aspect of the primitive view of women's magic function has never quite died out, the gradual decay and degradation of the primitive view has on the whole involved a lower estimate of women's nature and position. Woman has always been the witch she was, so even in ancient Babylonia, but she has ceased to be the priestess the early Teutons saw sanctum aliquid et providum in women who for the medieval German preacher were only bipedals and Schopenhauer, and even Nietzsche have been more inclined to side with the preacher than with the half-necked philosophers of Tacitus' day, but both views alike are but the extremes of the same primitive conception, and the gradual evolution from one extreme of the magical doctrine to the other was inevitable. In an advanced civilization, as we see these ideas having their ultimate basis on the old story of the serpent, and on a special and mysterious connection between the menstruating woman and the occult forces of magic, tend to die out. The separation of the sexes they involve becomes unnecessary. Living in greater community with men, women are seen to possess something, it may well be, but less than before, of the angel-devil of early theories. Menstruation is no longer a monstrific state requiring spiritual taboo, but a normal physiological process, not without its psychic influences on the woman herself and on those who live with her. Several recent works, however, notably Fraser's Golden Bough and Crawley's Mystic Rose, throw light directly or indirectly on this question. Robertson Smith points out that since snakes are the last noxious animals which man is able to exterminate, they are the last to be associated with demons. They were ultimately the only animals directly and constantly associated with the Arabian jinn or demon, and the serpent of Eden was a demon and not a temporary disguise of Satan. Religion of Semites, pp. 129 and 442. Perhaps it was in part because the snake was thus the last embodiment of demonic power that women were associated with it, women being always connected with the most ancient religious beliefs. In the Northern Territory of the same colony, menstruation is said to be due to bandicoots scratching the vagina and causing blood to flow. Journal of the Anthropological Institute, p. 177, November 1894. At Glenelg and near Portland in Victoria, the head of a snake was inserted into a virgin's vagina when not considered large enough for intercourse. For Smythe Aborigines of Victoria, Vol. Roman 2, p. 319. Fraser Golden Bough, Vol. Roman 2, p. 230. 1 Crawley, The Mystic Rose, p. 192, also brings together various cases of primitive peoples who believe the bite of a snake to be the cause of menstruation. Mayners d Estres, Études ethnographiques sur le lézard chez les peuples malais et Polynesians, L'Anthropologie, 1892. See also as regards the lizard in Samoan Folklore, Globus Vol. Lx Ziv. No. 16. Journal Anthropological Society of Bombay, 1890, p. 589. Boudin, Études anthropologiques culte du serpent Paris, 1864, pp. 66-70, brings forward examples of this aspect of snake worship. Attilio de Marche, Il culto privato di Roma, p. 74. The association of the power of generation with a god in the form of a serpent is indeed common. See, for example, Sir W. Roman 1000 Ramsay, Cities of Phrygia, Vol. IP 94. It is noteworthy that one of the names for the penis used by the Swahili women of German East Africa in a kind of private language of their own is the snake Zash Zeitschrift für Ethnologie, p. 73, 1899. It may be added that meter interpretation de Quelques Rêves Archives de Psychologie, April 1907, brings forward various items of folklore showing the phallic significance of the serpent, as well as evidence indicating that in the dreams of women of today, the snake sometimes has a sexual significance. W. R. Smith, Kinship and Marriage, In early Arabia, 1885 p. 307, the point is elaborated in the same author's Religion of Semites' second edition appendix on holiness uncleanness, and Taboo pp. 44,654, see also Wellhausen, Rister Arabischen Heidentum's. Second edition pp. 16,777, even to the early Arabians, Wellhausen remarks p. 168 clean meant profane and allowed, while unclean meant sacred and forbidden. It was the same as Jastrow remarks Religion of Babylonia p. 662 among the Babylonian Semites. J. Roman 100 Fraser, The Golden Bough chapter 4364. I Durkheim la prohibition de l'inceste, et ses origines l'année sociologique première année, 1898, SPP 44, 46, 47, 48, 50, 57, Crawley Mystic Rose p. 212, opposes Durkheim's view as to the significance of blood in relation to the attitude towards women. British Association Report on Northwestern Tribes of Canada, 1890 p. 581. Laws of Manu, Roman 4, 41. Pliny, who in Book 7, Chapter 13, and Book 28, Chapter 23 of his Natural History, gives long lists of the various good and evil influences attributed to menstruation rites in the latter place. Hailstorms, they say, whirlwinds and lightnings even will be scared away by a woman uncovering her body, while her monthly courses are upon her, the same too with all other kinds of tempestuous weather, and out at sea, a storm may be stilled by a woman uncovering her body, merely, even though not menstruating at the time, at any other time also, if a woman strips herself naked, while she is menstruating, and walks round a field of wheat, the caterpillars, worms, beetles, and other vermin will fall from off the ears of corn. See Burke's Scatologic Rights of All Nations, 1891, pp. 217,219, 250, and 254 plus, and Max Bartels des Weibwahl IH Roman 50, Strack der Bluterberglob in der Menschheit 4th edition, 1892 pp. 14, 18. The last mentioned refers to the efficacy frequently attributed to menstrual blood in the Middle Ages incurring leprosy, and gives instances occurring even in Germany today of girls who have administered drops of menstrual blood in coffee to their sweethearts to make sure of retaining their affections. See, for example, Duffer Histoire de la Prostitution, Vol. Roman 3 p. 115. Dr. Roman 50, Laurent, gives these instances de quelques phénomènes mécaniques produits au moment de la menstruation, Annals des Sciences Psychiques, September and October 1897. Journal Anthropological Society of Bombay, 1890 p. 403. Even the glance of a menstruating woman is widely believed to have serious results. See Touchman La Fascination Melusine, 1880, 8 pp. 347, et seq. As quoted in the Provincial Medical Journal, April 1891. Appendix B. Sexual Periodicity in Men. By F. H. Pericost, B.Sc. Land. In a recent brochure on the rhythm of the pulse, I showed inter alia that the readings of the pulse in both man and woman, if arranged in lunar monthly periods and averaged over several years, displayed a clear and sometimes very strongly marked and symmetrical rhythm, after pointing out that in at any rate some cases the male and female pulse curves, both monthly and annual, seem to be converse to one another. I added, it is difficult to ignore the suggestion that in this tracing of the monthly rhythm of the pulse, we have a history of the monthly function in women, and that if so, the tracing of the male pulse may eventually afford us some help in discovering a corresponding monthly period in men, the existence of which has been suggested by Mr. Havelock Ellis and Professor Stanley Hall, among other writers. Certainly, the mere fact that we can trace a clear monthly rhythm in man's pulse seems to point strongly to the existence of a monthly physiological period in him also. Obviously, however, it is only indirectly and by inference that we can argue from a monthly rhythm of the pulse in men to a male sexual periodicity, but I am now able to adduce more direct evidence that will fairly demonstrate the existence of a sexual periodicity in men. We will start from the fact that celibacy is profoundly unnatural, and is therefore a physical as well as an emotional and intellectual abnormality. This being so, it is entirely in accord with all that we know of physiology that when relief to the sexual secretory system by nature's means is denied, and when in consequence a certain degree of tension or pressure has been attained, the system should relieve itself by a spontaneous discharge. Such discharge being, of course, in the strict sense of the term pathological, since it would never occur in any animal that followed the strict law of its physical being without any regard to other and higher laws of concern for its fellows. Notoriously, that which we should have anticipated a priori actually occurs for any unmarried man who lives in strict chastity, periodically experiences, while sleeping, a loss of seminal fluid, such phenomena being popularly referred to as wet dreams. During some 8 or 10 years, I have carefully recorded the occurrence of such discharges as I have experienced myself, and I have now accumulated sufficient data to justify an attempt to formulate some provisional conclusions. In order to render these observations as serviceable as may be to students of periodicity, I here repeat, at the request of Mr. Havelock Ellis, the statement which was subjoined for the same reasons to my rhythm of the pulse. These observations upon myself were made between the ages of 20 and 33. I am about 5 feet 9 inches tall, broad-shouldered, and weigh about 10 stone 3 pounds, net thighs weight being, I believe, about 7 pounds below the normal for my height. Also, I have green-brown eyes, very dark brown hair, and a complexion that leads strangers frequently to mistake me for a foreigner, this complexion being perhaps attributable to some Huguenot blood. Although on the maternal side, I am, so far as all information goes, pure English, I can stand a good deal of heat, enjoy relaxing climates, am at once upset by bracing sea air, hate the cold, and sweat profusely after exercise. To this, it will suffice to add that my temperament is of a decidedly nervous and emotional type. Before proceeding to remark upon the various rhythms that I have discovered, I will tabulate the data on which my conclusions are founded. The numbers of discharges recorded in the years in question are as follows. In 1886, 30 records commenced in April. In 1880, 740. In 1880, 837. In 1889, 18 pretty certainly not fully recorded. In 1890, 0 no records kept this year. In 1890, 119 records recommenced in June. In 1892, 35. In 1893, 40. In 1894, 38. In 1895, 36. In 1896, 36. In 1897, 35. Average 37, omitting 1886, 1889, and 1891. Thus I have complete records for 8 years, and incomplete records for 3 more, and the remarkable concord between the respective annual numbers of observations in these 8 years not only affords us intrinsic evidence of the accuracy of my records, but also at once proves that there is an undeniable regularity in the occurrence of these sexual discharges, and therefore gives us reason for expecting to find this regularity rhythmical. Moreover, since it seemed reasonable to expect that there might be more than one rhythm, I have examined my data with a view to discovering 1 an annual, 2 a lunar monthly, and 3 a weekly rhythm, and I now proceed to show that all 3 such rhythms exist. The annual rhythm. It is obvious that in searching for an annual rhythm, we must ignore the records of the 3 incomplete years, but those of the remaining 8 are graphically depicted upon chart Roman 8. The curves speak so plainly for themselves that any comment were almost superfluous, and the concord between the various curves, although of course not perfect, is far greater than the scantiness of the data would have justified us in expecting. The curves all agree in pointing to the existence of 3 well-defined maximaves in March, June, and September, these being therefore the months in which the sexual instinct is most active, and the later curves show that there is also often a 4th maximum in January in the earlier years. The March and June maxima are more strikingly marked than the September one, but the uppermost curve shows that on the average of all 8 years, the September maximum is the highest, the June and January maxima occupying the 2nd place, and the March maximum being the least strongly marked of all. Now remembering that in calculating the curves of the annual rhythm of the pulse, I had found it necessary to average 2 months' records together. In order to bring out the full significance of the rhythm, I thought it well to try the effect upon these curves also of similarly. Averaging 2 months together, at first my results were fairly satisfactory, but as my data increased year by year, I found that these curves were contradicting one another, and therefore concluded that I had selected unnatural periods for my averaging. My first attempted remedy was to arrange the months in the pairs December, January, February, March, etc., instead of in January, February, March, April, etc. But with these pairs, I fared no better than with the former. I then arranged the months in the triplets January, February, March, etc., and the results are graphically recorded on chart Roman 7. Here again comment would be quite futile, but I need only point out that on the whole, the sexual activity rises steadily during the first 9 months in the year to its maximum in September, and then sinks rapidly and abruptly during the next 3 to its minimum in December. The study of these curves suggests 2 interesting questions, to neither of which, however, do the data afford us an answer. In the first place, are the alterations in my case of the maximum of the discharges from March and June in the earlier years to September in the later, and the interpolation of a new secondary maximum in January correlated with the increase in age, or is the discrepancy due simply to a temporary irregularity that would have been equally averaged out had I recorded the discharges of 188,189 instead of those from 1887 to 1897. The second question is one of very great importance socially, ethically, and physically. How often in this climate should a man have sexual connection with his wife in order to maintain himself in perfect physiological equilibrium? My results enable us to state definitely the minimum limits, and to reply that 37 embraces annually would be too few, but unfortunately, they give us no clue to the maximum limit. It is obvious that the necessary frequency should be greater than 37 times annually, possibly very considerably in excess thereof, seeing that the spontaneous discharges with which we are dealing are due to overpressure and occur only when the system, being denied natural relief, can no longer retain its secretions, and therefore it seems very reasonable to suggest that the frequency of natural relief should be some multiple of 37. I do not perceive, however, that the data in hand afford us any clue to this multiple or enable us to suggest either 2, 3, 4, or 5 as the required multiple of 37. It is true that other observations upon myself have afforded me what I believe to be a fairly satisfactory and reliable answer so far as concerns myself, but these observations are of such a nature that they cannot be discussed here, and I have no inclination to offer as a counsel to others an opinion which I am unable to justify by the citation of facts and statistics. Moreover, I am quite unable to opine whether, given 37 as the annual frequency of spontaneous discharges in a number of men, the multiple required for the frequency of natural relief should be the same in every case. For aught I know to the contrary, the physiological idiosyncrasies of men may be so varied that, given 2 men with an annual frequency of 37 spontaneous discharges, the desired multiple may be in one case X, and in the other 2X. Our data, however, do clearly denote that the frequency in the 6 or 8 summer months should bear to the frequency of the 6 or 4 winter months, the proportion of 3 or 4 to 2. It should never be forgotten, however, that under all conditions, both man and wife should exercise prudence both selfward and otherward, and that each should utterly refuse to gratify self by accepting a sacrifice, however willingly offered, that may be gravely prejudicial to the health of the other, for only experience can show whether in any union the receptivity of the woman be greater or less than or equal to the physical desire of the man. To those, of course, who regard marriage from the old-fashioned and grossly immoral standpoint of Melanchthon and other theologians, and who consider a wife as the divinely ordained vehicle for the chartered intemperance of her husband, it will seem grotesque in the highest degree that a physiological inquirer should attempt to advise them how often to seek the embraces of their wives. But those who regard woman from the standpoint of a higher ethics, who abhor the notion that she should be only the vehicle for her husband's passions, and who demand that she shall be mistress of her own body, will not be ungrateful for any guidance that physiology can afford them. It will be seen presently, moreover, that the study of the weekly rhythm does afford us some less inexact clue to the desired solution. One curious fact may be mentioned before we quit this interesting question. It is stated that Solon required of the husband 3 payments per month. By the Mishnah, a daily debt was imposed upon an idle, vigorous young husband twice a week, on a citizen once in 30 days, on a camel driver once in 6 months, on a seaman. Now, it is certainly striking that Solon's 3 payments per month exactly correspond with my records of 37 discharges annually, had Solon similarly recorded a series of observations upon himself. The lunar monthly rhythm. We now come to that division of the inquiry which is of the greatest physiological interest. Although of little social import, is there a monthly period in man as well as in woman? My records indicate clearly that there is. In searching for this monthly rhythm, I have utilized not only the data of the 8 completely recorded years, but also those of the 3 years of 1886, 1889, and 1891. For although it would obviously have been inaccurate to utilize these incomplete records when calculating the yearly rhythm, there seems no objection to making use of them in the present section of the inquiry. It is hardly necessary to remark that the terms first day of the month, second day, third day, etc., are to be understood as denoting new moon day, day after new moon, third lunar day, and so on, but it should be explained that since these discharges occur at night, I have adopted the astronomical instead of the civil day, so that a new moon occurring between noon yesterday and noon today is reckoned as occurring yesterday, and yesterday is regarded as the first lunar day. Thus a discharge occurring in the night between December 31st and January 1st is tabulated as occurring on December 31st, and in the present discussion is assigned to the lunar day comprised between noon of December 31st and noon of January 1st. Since it is obvious that the number of discharges in any one year, averaging, as they do only 1 per day, are far too few to yield a curve of any value, I have combined my data in 2 series. The dotted curve on chart Roman 9 is obtained by combining the results of the years 188,692. 2 of these years are incompletely recorded, and there are no records for 1890. The total number of observations was 179. The broken curve is obtained by combining those of the years 189,397, the total number of observations being 185. Even so, the data are far too scanty to yield a really characteristic curve, but the continuous curve, which sums up the results of the 11 years, is more reliable and obviously more satisfactory. If the 2 former curves be compared, it will be seen that on the whole they display a general concordance, such differences as exist being attributable chiefly to 2 facts. 1. That the second curve is more even throughout, neither maximum nor minimum being so strongly marked as in the first, and 2. That the main maximum occurs in the middle of the month instead of on the second lunar day, and the absence of the marked initial maximum alters the character of the first week or so of this curve. It is, however, scarcely fair to lay any great stress on the characters of curves obtained from such scanty data, and we will therefore pass to the continuous curve, the study of which will prove more valuable. Now, even a cursory examination of this continuous curve will yield the following results. The discharges occur most frequently on the second lunar day. The days of the next most frequent discharges are the 22d, the 13th, the 7th, 20th, and 26th, the 11th and 16th, so that if we regard only the first 6 of these, we find that the discharges occur most frequently on the 2d, 7th, 13th, 20th, 22d, and 26th lunar days. Roman 1e. The discharges occur most frequently on days separated on the average by 4-day intervals, but actually the period between the 20th and 22d days is that characterized by the most frequent discharges. The days of minimum of discharge are the 1st, 5th, 15th, 18th, and 21st. The curve is characterized by a continual seesawing, so that every notable maximum is immediately followed by a notable minimum. Thus the curve is of an entirely different character from that representing the monthly rhythm of the pulse. And this is only what one might have expected, for whereas the mean pulsations vary only very slightly from day to day, thus giving rise to a gradually rising or sinking curvature, discharge from the sexual system relieves the tension by exhausting the stored-up secretion and is necessarily followed by some days of rest and inactivity in the very nature of the case. Therefore, a curve of this kind could not possibly be otherwise than most irregular if the discharges tended to occur most frequently upon definite days of the month. And thus the very irregularity of the curve affords us proof that there is a regular male periodicity, such that on certain days of the month there is greater probability of a spontaneous discharge than on any other days. Gratifying, however, though this irregularity of the curve may be, yet it entails a corresponding disadvantage, for we are precluded thereby from readily perceiving the characteristics of the monthly rhythm. As a whole, I thought that perhaps this aspect of the rhythm might be rendered plainer if I calculated the data into 2-day averages, and the result, as shown in Chart X, is extremely satisfactory. Here we can at once perceive the wonderful and almost geometric symmetry of the monthly rhythm. Indeed, if the third maximum were 1 unit higher, if the first minimum were 1 unit lower, and if the lines joining the second minimum and third maximum and the fourth maximum and fourth minimum were straight instead of being slightly broken, then the curve would in its chief features be geometrically symmetrical, and this symmetry appears to me to afford a convincing proof of the representative accuracy of the curve. We see that the month is divided into 5 periods, that the maxima occur on the following pairs of days: the 19th, 20th, 13th, 14th, 25th, 26th, 1st to D7th, 8th, and that the minima occur at the beginning, end, and exact middle of the month. There have been many idle superstitions as to the influence of the moon upon the earth and its inhabitants, and some beliefs that once deemed equally idle have now been reinstated in the regard of science. But it would certainly seem to be a very fascinating and very curious fact if the influence of the moon upon men should be such as to regulate the spontaneous discharges of their sexual system. Certainly, the lovers of all ages would then have builded better than they knew when they reared altars of devotional verse to that chaste goddess Artemis. The weekly rhythm. We now come to the third branch of our inquiry and have to ask whether there be any weekly rhythm of the sexual activity a priori. It might be answered that to expect any such weekly rhythm were absurd, seeing that our weeken like the lunar month of the Eurus, a purely artificial and conventional period, while on the other hand it might be retorted that the existence of an induced weekly periodicity is quite conceivable, such periodicity being induced by the habitual difference between our occupation or mode of life on 1 or 2 days of the week, and that on the remaining days in such an inquiry, however, a priori argument is futile, as the question can be answered only by an induction from observations, and the curves on Chart Xi, Chart Xia, and Chart Zib prove conclusively that there is a notable weekly rhythm. The existence of this weekly rhythm being granted, it would naturally be assumed that either the maximum or the minimum would regularly occur on Saturday or Sunday, but an examination of the curves discloses the unexpected result that the day of maximum discharge varies from year to year. Thus it is Sunday in 1888, 1892, 1896. Tuesday in 1894. Thursday in 1886, 1897. Friday in 1887. Saturday in 1893 and 1895. Since in Chart Xi the curves are drawn from Sunday to Sunday, it is obvious that the real symmetry of the curve is brought out in those years only which are characterized by a Sunday maximum, and accordingly, in Chart 12, I have depicted the curves in a more suitable form. Chart Roman 12a is obtained by combining the data of 1888, 1892, and 1896. The years of a Sunday maximum. Curve 12b represents the results of 1894, the year of a Tuesday maximum, multiplied throughout by 3, in order to render the curve strictly comparable with the former. Curve 12c represents 1886 and 1897, the years of a Thursday maximum, similarly multiplied by 1. In Curve 12d, we have the results of 1887, the year of a Friday maximum, again multiplied by 3, and in Curve 12e those of 1893, and 1895. The years of a Saturday maxima multiplied by one finally curved 12F represents the combined results of all 9 years plus the latter half of 1891. And this curve shows that on the whole period, there is a very strongly marked Sunday maximum. I hardly think that these curves call for much comment in their general character. They display a notable concord among themselves, and it is significant that the most regular of the 5 curves are A and E, representing the combinations of 3 years and of 2 years respectively, while the least regular is B, which is based upon the records of 1 year. Only in every case, we find that the maximum which opens the week is rapidly succeeded by a minimum which is itself succeeded by a secondary maximum, usually very secondary, although in 1894 it nearly equals the primary maximum, followed again by a second minimum, usually nearly identical with the first minimum, after which there is a rapid rise to the original maximum. The study of these curves fortunately amplifies the conclusion drawn from our study of the annual rhythm, and suggests that in at least part of the year, the physiological condition of man requires sexual union at least twice a week. As to curve 12F, its remarkable symmetry speaks for itself. The existence of 2 secondary maxima, however, has not the same significance as had that of our secondary maximum in the preceding curves, for one of these secondary maxima is due to the influence of the 1894 curve, with its primary Tuesday maximum, and the other to the similar influence of curve C, with its primary Thursday maximum. Similarly, the veiled third secondary maximum is due to the influence of curve E. Probably any student of curves will concede that on a still larger average, the 2 secondary maxima of curve F would be replaced by a single one on Wednesday or Thursday. One more question remains for consideration in connection with this weekly rhythm. Is it possible to trace any connection between the weekly and yearly rhythms of such a character that the weekly day of maximum discharge should vary from month to month in the year? In other words, does the greater frequency of a Sunday discharge characterize one part of the year, that of a Tuesday another, and so on? In order to answer this question, I have recalculated all my data with results that are graphically represented in chart Roman 13. These curves prove that the Sunday maxima discharges occur in March and September, and the minima in June, that the Monday maxima discharges occur in September, Friday in July, and so on. Thus, there is a regular rhythm according to which the days of maximum discharge vary from one month of the year to another, and the existence of this final rhythm appears to me very remarkable. I would especially direct attention to the almost geometric symmetry of the Sunday curve, and to the only less complete symmetry of the Thursday and Friday curves. Certainly, in these rhythms, we have an ample field for farther study and speculation. I have now concluded my study of this fascinating inquiry, a study that is necessarily incomplete, since it is based upon records furnished by one individual only. The fact, however, that even with so few observations, and notwithstanding the consequently exaggerated disturbing influence of minor irregularities, such remarkable and unexpected symmetry is evidenced by these curves only increases one's desire to have the opportunity of handling a series of observations sufficiently numerous to render the generalizations induced from them absolutely conclusive. I would again appeal to heads of colleges to assist this inquiry by enlisting in its aid a band of students. If only 100 students living under similar conditions could be induced to keep such records with scrupulous regularity for only 12 months, the results induced from such a series of observations would be more than 10 times as valuable as those which have only been reached after 10 years' observations on my part. And if other centuries of students in foreign and colonial colleges in Italy, India, Australia, and America could be similarly enlisted in this work, we should quickly obtain a series of results exhibiting the sexual needs and sexual peculiarities of the male human animal in various climates. Obviously, however, the records of any such students would be worse than useless, unless their care and accuracy on the one hand and their habitual chastity on the other could be implicitly guaranteed. First published in the University Magazine and Free Review of February 1898, and since reprinted as a pamphlet, a preliminary communication appeared in Nature May 14, 1891. Later study 1906 has convinced me that my attempt to find a lunar monthly period in the female pulse was vitiated by a hopeless error, for any monthly rhythm in a woman must be sought by arranging her records according to her own menstrual month, and this menstrual month may vary in different women from considerably less than a lunar month to 30 days or more. I may add, however, that in my own case, these discharges are so far as I can trust my waking consciousness frequently, if not usually dreamless, and that strictly sexual dreams are extremely rare, notwithstanding the possession of a strongly emotional temperament. If I can trust my memory, I first experienced this discharge when a few months under 15 years of age, and if so, within a few weeks of the time when I was in an instant suddenly struck with the thought that possibly the religion in which I had been educated might be false. It is curiously interesting that the advent of puberty should have been heralded by this intellectual crisis. This unfortunate breach in the records was due to the fact that, failing to discover any regularity in or law of the occurrences of the discharges, I became discouraged and abandoned my records in June 1891. A re-examination of my pulse records having led to my discovery of a lunar monthly rhythm of the pulse, my interest in other physiological periodicities was reawakened, and I recommenced my records of these discharges. As a matter of fact, I take it that we may safely assert that no man who is content to be guided by his own instinctive cravings, and who neither suppresses these on the one hand nor endeavors to force himself on the other hand, will be in any danger of erring by either excess or the contrary. It is obvious that the opportunity of continuing such an inquiry as that described in this appendix ceases with marriage, but I may add 1906 that certain notes that I have kept with scrupulous exactness during 8 years of married life lend almost no support to the suggestion made in the text Roman 1e that sexual desire is greater at one season of the year than at another. The nature of these notes I cannot discuss, but they clearly indicate that although there is a slight degree more of sexual desire in the second and third quarters of the year than in the first and fourth, yet this difference is so slight as to be almost negligible even if the months be rearranged in the triplets November, December, January, exo, as to bring the maximum months of May, June, and July together. The difference between the highest quarter and the lowest amounts to an increase of only 10% upon the latter, after allowing, of course, for the abnormal shortness of February and neglecting February. The increase in the maximum months June and July over the minimum November is equal to an increase of under 14% upon the latter. These differences are so vastly less than those shown on chart Roman 7 that they possess almost no significance, but lest too much stress be laid upon the apparently equalizing influence of married life, it must be added that the records discussed in the text were obtained during residence in London, whereas since my marriage I have lived in South Cornwall, where the climate is both milder and more equable. Selden's Uxor Hebraica, as quoted in Gibbon's Decline, and Fall Vol VP 52 of Bond's edition. I may add that the curve yielded by 189,697 is remarkably parallel with that yielded by the preceding 9 years, but I have not thought it worth while to chart these two additional curves. See Rhythm of the Pulse chart, Roman 4383. As will be observed, I have omitted the results of the incompletely recorded years of 1889 and 1891. The apparent explanation of this curious oscillation will be given directly. See Rhythm of the Pulse p. 21. Appendix Roman 100, the autoerotic factor in religion. The intimate association between the emotions of love and religion is well known to all those who are habitually brought into close contact with the phenomena of the religious life. Love and religion are the two most volcanic emotions to which the human organism is liable, and it is not surprising that when there is a disturbance in one of these spheres, the vibrations should readily extend to the other, nor is it surprising that the two emotions should have a dynamic relation to each other, and that the autoerotic impulse, being the more primitive and fundamental of the two impulses, should be able to pass its unexpended energy over to the religious emotion. there to find the expansion hitherto denied it the love of the human, becoming the love of the divine. I was not good enough for man, and so am given to God. Even when there is absolute physical suppression on the sexual side, it seems probable that thereby a greater intensity of spiritual fervor is caused. Many eminent thinkers seem to have been without sexual desire. It is a noteworthy and significant fact that the age of love is also the age of conversion. Starbuck, for instance, in his very elaborate study of the psychology of conversion, shows that the majority of conversions take place during the period of adolescence, that is from the age of puberty to about 24 or 25,385. It would be easy to bring forward a long series of observations from the most various points of view to show the wide recognition of this close affinity between the sexual and the religious emotions. It is probable, as Hahn points out, that the connection between sexual suppression and religious rites, which we may trace at the very beginning of culture, was due to an instinctive impulse to heighten rather than abolish the sexual element. Early religious rites were largely sexual and orgiastic, because they were largely an appeal to the generative forces of nature to exhibit a beneficial productiveness among happily married people. As Hahn remarks, the sexual emotions rapidly give place to the cares and anxieties involved in supporting children, but when the exercise of the sexual function is prevented by celibacy or even by castration, the most complete form of celibacy, the sexual emotions may pass into the psychical sphere to take on a more pronounced shape. The early Christians adopted the traditional Eastern association between religion and celibacy, and as the writings of the Fathers amply show, they expended on sexual matters a concentrated fervor of thought rarely known to the Greek and Roman writers of the best period. As Christian theology developed, the minute inquisition into sexual things sometimes became almost an obsession. So far as I am aware, however, I cannot profess to have made any special investigation. It was not until the late Middle Ages that there is any clear recognition of the fact that between the religious emotions and the sexual emotions there is not only a superficial antagonism, but an underlying relationship. At this time, so great a theologian and philosopher as Aquinas said that it is especially on the days when a man is seeking to make himself pleasing to God that the devil troubles him by polluting him with seminal emissions. With somewhat more psychological insight, the wise old knight of the Tower, Landry, in the 14th century, tells his daughters that no young woman in love can ever serve her God with that unfeignedness which she did aforetime, for I have heard it argued by many who in their young days had been in love, that when they were in the church, the condition and the pleasing melancholy in which they found themselves would infallibly set them brooding over all their tender lovesick longings and all their amorous passages, when they should have been attending to the service which was going on at the time. And such is the property of this mystery of love, that it is ever at the moment when the priest is holding our Savior upon the altar that the most enticing emotions come. After narrating the history of two queens beyond the seas who indulged in amours, even on Holy Thursday and Good Friday at midnight in their oratories, when the lights were put out, he concludes every woman in love is more liable to fall in church or at her devotion than at any other time. The connection between religious emotion and sexual emotion was very clearly set forth by Swift about the end of the 17th century in a passage which it may be worthwhile to quote from his discourse concerning the mechanical operation of the spirit, after mentioning that he was informed by a very eminent physician that when the Quakers first appeared, he was seldom without female Quaker patients affected with nymphomania. Swift continues, persons of a visionary devotion, either men or women, are in their complexion of all others the most amorous, for zeal is frequently kindled from the same spark with other fires, and from inflaming brotherly love will proceed to raise that of a gallant. If we inspect into the usual process of modern courtship, we shall find it to consist in a devout turn of the eyes, called ogling, an artificial form of canting and whining, by rote every interval for want of other matter, made up with a shrug or a hum, a sigh or a groan, the style compact of insignificant words, incoherences and repetitions, These I take to be the most accomplished rules of address to a mistress, and where are these performed with more dexterity than by the saints? Nay, to bring this argument yet closer, I have been informed by certain sanguine brethren of the first class that in the height and orgasmus of their spiritual exercise, it has been frequent with them, immediately after which they found the spirit to relax and flag of a sudden with the nerves, and they were forced to hasten to a conclusion. This may be farther strengthened by observing with wonder how unaccountably all females are attracted by visionary or enthusiastic preachers, though never so contemptible in their outward mien, which is usually supposed to be done upon considerations purely spiritual, without any carnal regards at all. But I have reason to think the sex hath certain characteristics by which they form a truer judgment of human abilities and performings than we ourselves can possibly do of each other. Let that be as it will. Thus much is certain, that however spiritual intrigues begin, they generally conclude. Like all others, they may branch upwards toward heaven, but the root is in the earth. Too intense a contemplation is not the business of flesh and blood. It must by the necessary course of things in a little time let go its hold, and fall into matter. Lovers, for the sake of celestial converse, are but another sort of platonics, who pretend to see stars and heaven in ladies' eyes, and to look or think no lower, but the same pit is provided for both. To come down to recent times, in the last century, the headmaster of Clifton College, when discussing the sexual vices of boyhood, remarked that the boys whose temperament exposes them to these faults are usually far from destitute of religious feelings, that there is, and always has been, an undoubted coexistence of religion and animalism, that emotional appeals and revivals are far from rooting out carnal sin, and that in some places, as is well known, they seem actually to stimulate, even at the present day, to increased licentiousness. It is not difficult to see how even in technique the method of the revivalist is a quasi-sexual method, and resembles the attempt of the male to overcome the sexual shyness of the female. In each case, as W. Thomas remarks, the will has to be set aside, and strong suggestive means are used, and in both cases the appeal is not of the conflict type, but of an intimate, sympathetic, and pleading kind. In the effort to make a moral adjustment, it consequently turns out that a technique is used which was derived originally from sexual life, and the use, so to speak, of the sexual machinery for a moral adjustment involves in some cases the carrying over into the general process of some sexual manifestations. The relationship of the sexual and the religious emotions, like so many other of the essential characters of human nature, is seen in its nakedest shape by the alienist Esquirol, referred to this relationship, and many years ago J.B. Friedreich, a German alienist of wide outlook and considerable insight, emphasized the connection between the sexual and the religious emotions, and brought forward illustrative cases. Schroeder van der Kalk also remarked, I venture to express my conviction that we should rarely err if in a case of religious melancholy we assumed the sexual apparatus to be implicated. Regis in France lays it down that there exists a close connection between mystic ideas and erotic ideas, and most often these two orders of conception are associated. In Insanity, Berthier considered that erotic forms of insanity are those most frequently found in convents. Bevan Lewis points out how frequently religious exaltation occurs at puberty in women, and religious depression at the climacteric. The period of sexual decline. Religion is very closely allied to love, remarks Savage, and the love of woman and the worship of God are constantly sources of trouble in unstable youth. It is very interesting to note the frequency with which these two deep feelings are associated, closely connected with salacity, particularly in women, remarks Connolly Norman, when discussing mania. Tuke's Dictionary of Psychological Medicine. Is religious excitement ecstasy, as we see in cases of acute mental disease, is probably always connected with sexual excitement, if not with sexual depravity. The same association is constantly seen in less extreme cases, and one of the commonest features in the conversation of an acutely maniacal woman is the intermingling of erotic and religious ideas. Patients who believe, remarks Clara Barris, that they are the Virgin Mary, the bride of Christ, the Church, God's wife, and Raphael's consort, are sure sooner or later to disclose symptoms which show that they are some way or other sexually depraved fool, who devotes a chapter of his book Die Sexual Frage to the subject, argues that the strongest feelings of religious emotion are often unconsciously rooted in erotic emotion or represent a transformation of such emotion. And in an interesting discussion, ch. Romans 6 of this question in his Sexualleben unsere Zeitblock states that in a certain sense, we may describe the history of religions as the history of a special manifestation of the human sexual instinct. Ball, Broadel, Morcelli Vallon, and Marie Roman 100 H. Hughes to mention, but a few names among many have emphasized the same point. Kraft, Ebbing deals briefly with the connection between holiness and the sexual emotion and the special liability of the saints to sexual temptations. He thus states his own conclusions: religious and sexual emotional states, at the height of their development, exhibit a harmony in quantity and quality of excitement, and can thus, in certain circumstances, act vicariously. Both, he adds, can be converted into cruelty under pathological conditions. After quoting these opinions, it is perhaps not unnecessary to point out that while sexual emotion constitutes the main reservoir of energy on which religion can draw, it is far from constituting either the whole content of religion or its root. Muricier, in an able study of the psychology of religious ecstasy, justly protests against too crude an explanation of its nature, though at the same time he admits that the passion of the religious ecstatic lacks nothing of what goes to make up sexual love, not even jealousy. Siriu, in his little work, Recherches cliniques sur les anomalies de l'instinct sexuel valuable, on account of its instructive cases, records in detail a case which so admirably illustrates this phase of autoerotism on the borderland between ordinary erotic daydreaming and religious mysticism, the phenomena for a time reaching an insane degree of intensity that I summarize it. Therese Roman 1000 aged 24, shows physical stigmata of degeneration. The heredity is also bad. The father is a man of reckless and irregular conduct. The mother was at one time in a lunatic asylum. The patient was brought up in an orphanage and was a troublesome, volatile child. She treated household occupations with contempt, but was fond of study even at an early age. Her lively imagination attracted attention, and the pleasure which she took in building castles in the air from the age of 7 to 10. She masturbated at her first communion. She felt that Jesus would forever be the one master of her heart. At 13, after the death of her mother, she seemed to see her and to hear her say that she was watching over her child. Shortly afterward, she was overwhelmed by a new grief, the death of a teacher for whom she cherished great affection on account of her pure character. On the following day, she seemed to see and hear this teacher and would not leave the house where the body lay. Tendencies to melancholy appeared, saddened by the funeral ceremonies, exhorted by nuns, fed on mystic reverie. She passed from the orphanage to a convent. She devoted herself solely to the worship of Jesus. To be like Jesus, to be near Jesus became her constant preoccupations. The Virgin's name was rarely seen in her writings. God's name. Never. I wanted, she said, to love Jesus more than any of the nuns I saw, and I even thought that he had a partiality for me. She was also haunted by the idea of preserving her purity. She avoided frivolous conversation and left the room when marriage was discussed, such a union being incompatible with a pure life. It was my fixed idea for 2 years to make my soul ever more pure in order to be agreeable to him. The beloved is well pleased among the lilies. Already, however, in a rudimentary form, appeared contrary tendencies. Strictly speaking, they were not contrary, but related tendencies. Beneath the mystic passion which concealed its sexual desire was sometimes felt. At 16, she experienced emotions which she could not master. When thinking of a priest who she said loved her, in spite of all remorse, she would have been willing to have relations with him, notwithstanding these passing weaknesses. The idea of purity always possessed her. The nuns, however, were concerned about her exaltation. She was sent away from the convent, became discouraged, and took a place as a servant. But her fervor continued. Her confessor inspired her with great affection. She sends him tender letters. She would be willing to have relations with him, even though she considers the desire a temptation of the devil. The ground was now prepared for the manifestation of hallucinations. One evening in May, she writes, after being absorbed in thoughts of my confessor and feeling discouraged, as I thought that Jesus, whom I loved so much, would have nothing to do with me, mother, I cried out, what must I do to win your son? My eyes were fixed on the sky, and I remained. State of mad expectation. It was absurd to become the mother of the world. My heart went on repeating, yes, he is coming, Jesus is coming. The psychic erethism, reverberating on the sensorial and sensory centers, led to genital, auditory, and visual hallucinations, which produced the sensation of sexual connection. For the first time, I went to bed, and was not alone. As soon as I felt that touch, I heard the words, fear not, it is Roman 1. I was lost in him, whom I loved. For many days I was cradled in a world of pleasure. I saw him everywhere, overwhelming me with his chaste caresses. On the following day, at Mass, she seemed to see Calvary. Before her, Jesus was naked and surrounded by 1,000 voluptuous imaginations. His arms were loosened from the cross, and he said to me, come. I longed to fly to him with my body, but could not make up my mind to show myself naked. However, I was carried away by a force I could not control. I threw myself on my Savior's neck, and felt that all was over between the world and me. From that day, by sheer reasoning, she has understood everything. Previously, she thought that the religious life was a renunciation of the joys of marriage and enjoyment generally. Now she understands its object. Jesus Christ desires that she should have relations with a priest. He is himself incarnated in priests. Just as St. Joseph was the guardian of the Virgin, so are priests the guardians of nuns. She has been impregnated by Jesus, and this imaginary pregnancy preoccupies her in the highest degree. From this time, she masturbated daily. She cannot even go to communion without experiencing voluptuous sensations. Her delusions having thus become systematized, nothing shakes her tenacity in seeking to carry them out. She attempts at all costs to have relations with her confessor, embraces him, throws herself at his knees, pursues him, and so becomes a cause of scandal. When brought to the asylum, there is intense sexual excitement, and she masturbates 12 times a day. Even when talking to the doctor, the sexual organs are normal, the vulva moist and red, the vagina is painful to touch. The contact of the finger causes erectile turgescence. She has had no rest, she says, since she has learned to love her Jesus. He desires her to have sexual relations with someone, and she cannot succeed. All my soul's strength is arrested by this constant endeavor. Her new surroundings modify her behavior, and now it is the doctor whom she pursues with her obsessions. I expected everything from the charity of the priests I have known. I have not deserved what I wanted from them. But is not a doctor free to do everything for the good of the patients entrusted to him by providence? Cannot a doctor thus devote himself? Since I have tasted the tree of life, I am tormented by the desire to share it with a loving friend. Then she falls in love with an employee and makes the crudest advances to him, believing that she is thus executing the will of Jesus. Necessity makes laws, she exclaims to him. The moments are pressing. I have been waiting too long. She still speaks of her religious vocation, which might be compromised by so long a delay. I do not want to get married. Gradually, a transformation took place. The love of God was effaced, and earthly love became more intense than ever. Quitting the heights in which I wished to soar, I am coming so near to earth that I shall soon fix my desires there. In a last letter, Therese recognizes with terror the insanity to which the exaltation of her imagination had led her. Now I only believe in God, and in suffering I feel that it is necessary for me to get married. Mariani has very fully described a case of erotic religious insanity, climacteric paranoia, on an hysterical basis, in a married woman of 44. During the early stages of her disorder, she inflicted all sorts of penances upon herself, fasting, constant prayer, drinking her own urine, cleaning dirty plates with her tongue, etc. Finally, she felt that by her penances she had obtained forgiveness of her sins, and then began a stage of joy and satisfaction, during which she believed that she had entered into a state of the most intimate personal relationship with Jesus. She finally recovered. Mariani shows how closely this history corresponds with the histories of the saints, and that all the acts and emotions of this woman can be exactly paralleled in the lives of famous saints. The justice of these comparisons becomes manifest When we turn to the records that have been left by holy persons, a most instructive record from this point of view is the autobiography of Sir Jean des Anges, superior of the Ursulines of Loudun in the 17th century. She was clever, beautiful, ambitious, fond of pleasure, still more of power. With this, as sometimes happens, she was highly hysterical, and in the early years of her religious life was possessed by various demons of unchastity and blasphemy, with whom for many years she was in constant struggle. She fell in love with a priest of Loudun Grandeur, a man whom she had never even seen, only knowing of him as a powerful and fascinating personality at whose feet all women fell, and she imagined that she and the other nuns of her convent were possessed through his influence. She was thus the cause of the trial and execution of Grandeur. Famous case in the annals of witchcraft. In her autobiography, Sir Jean describes in detail how the demons assailed her at night, appearing in lascivious attitudes, making indecent proposals, raising the bedclothes, touching all parts of her body, imploring her to yield to them. And she tells how strong her temptation was to yield. On one night, for instance, she writes, "I seemed to feel someone's breath, and I heard a voice saying the time for resistance has gone by. You must no longer rebel by putting off your consent to what has been proposed. You will be injured. You cannot persist in this resistance. God has subjected you to the demands of a nature which you must satisfy on occasions so urgent. Then I felt impure impressions in my imagination and disordered movements in my body. I persisted in saying at the bottom of my heart that I would do nothing. I turned to God and asked him for strength in this extraordinary struggle. Then there was a loud noise in my room, and I felt as if someone had approached me and put his hand into my bed and touched me. And having perceived this, I rose in a state of restlessness, which lasted for a long time afterward. Some days later, at midnight, I began to tremble all over my body as I lay in bed, and to experience much mental anxiety, without knowing the cause. After this had lasted for some time, I heard noises in various parts of my room. The sheet was twice pulled without entirely uncovering me. The oratory close to my bed was upset. I heard a voice on the left side toward which I was lying. I was asked if I had thought over the advantageous offer that had been made to me. It was added, "I have come to know your reply. I will keep my promise if you will give your consent. If on the contrary you refuse, you will be the most miserable girl in the world, and all sorts of mischances will happen to you." I replied, "If there were no God, I would fear those threats. I am consecrated to him." It was replied to me, "You will not get much help from God. He will abandon you." I replied, "God is my Father. He will take care of me. I have resolved to be faithful to him." He said, "I will give you 3 days to think over it." I rose and went to the Holy Sacrament with an anxious mind. Having returned to my room and being seated on a chair, it was drawn from under me so that I fell on the floor. Then the same things happened again. I heard a man's voice saying lascivious and pleasant things to seduce me. He pressed me to give him room in my bed. He tried to touch me in an indecent way. I resisted and prevented him, calling the nuns who were near my room. The window had been open. It was closed. I felt strong movements of love for a certain person and improper desire for dishonorable things. She writes again at a later period, "These impurities and the fire of concupiscence, which the evil spirit caused me to feel beyond all that I can say, forced me to throw myself on to braziers of hot coal, where I would remain for half an hour at a time, in order to extinguish that other fire, so that half my body was quite burnt. At other times, in the depth of winter, I have sometimes passed part of the night entirely naked in the snow or in tubs of icy water. I have besides often gone among thorns, so that I have been torn by them. At other times, I have rolled in nettles, and I have passed whole nights defying my enemies to attack me, and assuring them that I was resolved to defend myself with the grace of God, with her confessor's permission." She also had an iron girdle made with spikes, and wore this day and night for nearly 6 months, until the spikes so entered her flesh that the girdle could only be removed with difficulty. By means of these austerities, she succeeded in almost exorcising the demons of unchastity, and a little later, after a severe illness of which she believed that she was miraculously cured by St. Joseph, she appeared before the world almost as a saint herself, possessing a miraculous power of healing. She traveled through France bringing healing. Wherever she went, the king, the queen, and Cardinal Richelieu were at her feet, and so great became the fame of her holiness that her tomb was a shrine for pilgrims for more than a century. After her death, it was not until late in life, and after her autobiography terminates, that sexual desire in Sir Jean, though its sting seems never to have quite disappeared, became transformed into passionate love of Jesus, and it is only in her later letters that we catch glimpses of the complete transmutation. Thus, in one of her later letters, we read, "I cried with ardor, Lord, join me to thyself, transform thyself into me. It seemed to me that that lovable spouse was reposing in my heart, as on his throne. What makes me almost swoon with love and admiration is a certain pleasure, which it seems to me that he takes when all my being flows into his restoring to him, with respect and love, all that he has given to me. Sometimes I have permission to speak to our Lord with more familiarity, calling him my love, interesting him in all that I ask of him, as well for myself as for others." The lives of all the great saints and mystics bear witness to operations similar to those so vividly described by Sir Jean des Anges, though it is very rarely that any saint has so frankly presented the dynamic mechanism of the autoerotic process. The indications they give us, however, are sufficiently clear. It is enough to refer to the special affection which the mystics have ever borne toward the Song of Songs, and to note how the most earthly expressions of love in that poem enter as a perpetual refrain into their writings. The courage of the early Christian martyrs, it is abundantly evident, was in part supported by an exaltation which they frankly drew from the sexual impulse follicular. We are told in the Acts of Achilles, and Nereus preferred imprisonment, torture, and death to marriage or pagan sacrifices. When on the rack she was bidden to deny Christianity, she exclaimed, "Ego non nego amatorum meum, I will not deny my lover, who for my sake has eaten gall and drunk vinegar crowned with thorns, and fastened to the cross." Christian mysticism and its sexual coloring was absorbed by the Islamic world at a very early period and intensified in the 13th century. It was reintroduced into Christendom in this intensified form by the genius of Raymond Lull, who had himself been born on the confines of Islam, and his book of The Lover and the Friend is a typical manifestation of sexual mysticism, which inspired the great Spanish school of mystics. A few centuries later, the delicious agony, the sweet martyrdom, the strongly combined pleasure and pain experienced by St. Teresa were certainly associated with physical sexual sensations. The case of Marguerite Marie Alacoque is typical. Jesus, as her autobiography shows, was always her lover, her husband, her dear master. She is betrothed to him. He is the most passionate of lovers. Nothing can be sweeter than his caresses. They are so excessive she is beside herself with the delight of them. The central imagination of the mystic consists essentially, as Ribot remarks, in a love romance. If we turn to the most popular devotional work that was ever written, The Imitation of Christ, we shall find that the love there expressed is precisely and exactly the love that finds its motive power in the emotions aroused by a person of the other sex. A very intellectual woman once remarked to me that the book seemed to her sort of religious aphrodisiac. If we read, for instance, Book 3, Chapter 5 of this work, De Mirabili, Affectu Divini Amoris, we shall find in the eloquence of this solitary monk, in the Low Countries, neither more nor less than the emotions of every human lover at their highest limit of exaltation. Nothing is sweeter than, nothing stronger, nothing higher, nothing broader, nothing pleasanter, nothing fuller nor better in heaven or in earth. He who loves flies, runs, and rejoices. He is free and cannot be held. He gives all in exchange for all, and possesses all in all. He looks not at gifts, but turns to the giver. Above all good things, love knows no measure, but is fervent beyond all measure. Love feels no burden, thinks nothing of labor, strives beyond its force, reckons not of impossibility, for it judges that all things are possible. Therefore it attempts all things, and therefore it effects much. When he who is not a lover fails, and falls, my love, thou all mine, and I all thine. There is a certain natural disinclination in many quarters to recognize any special connection between the sexual emotions and the religious emotions. But this attitude is not reasonable. A man who is swayed by religious emotions cannot be held responsible for the indirect emotional results of his condition. He can be held responsible for their control. Nothing is gained by refusing to face the possibility that such control may be necessary, and much is lost. There is certainly, as I have tried to indicate, good reason to think that the action and interaction between the spheres of sexual and religious emotion are very intimate. The obscure promptings of the organism at puberty frequently assume on the psychic side a wholly religious character. The activity of the religious emotions sometimes tends to pass over into the sexual region. The suppression of the sexual emotions often furnishes a powerful reservoir of energy to the religious emotions. Occasionally, the suppressed sexual emotions break through all obstacles.